Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. As we continue with Part 10, Masonry in Norman Times from the Arcane Schools, a review of their origin and antiquity with a general history of Freemasonry and its relation to the theosophic, scientific and philosophic mysteries by John Yarker. Masonry in Norman England. We made mention in our last chapter of a series of Masonic legends which are, in some measure, historically opposed to the old Saxon constitutions. These first appear in written documents of about 1450 AD, but as these are copies of still older manuscripts may well date into the 12th century in this country. There are two old manuscripts, the laws of which differ in essential points. In the Elder or Cook manuscript, those legends which imply a Semitic origin and actually represent our present craft rites form the preface or commentary to an actual Saxon charge, whilst the later or Watson manuscript is a copy of a much older document and itself over 2 centuries old, is complete in itself, with a modified series of charges. The second part might belong to a guild which had a traditional preference to a Saxon constitution, and the first to a later compiler, one who had accepted the Norman system and its rites. We will endeavor in this chapter to supply such reliable information as can be gathered to account for the legends superimposed upon the older. It is in Norman times, adding French details, that this matter shows itself, and as there is yet no established view on the subject, it may be examined in various aspects. In the first place, these legends may have been fixed in France by the conquests which the Saracens made in that country. Or secondly, they may have reached that country through the Moorish conquests in Spain. Or thirdly, and a probable view, they might have been brought from the east by those Masons who returned in the train of the Crusaders. Lastly, but upon this we place small credence. Some of our able critics have held that the Oriental legends are collected from books of general history by the first compiler of this version of the charges, though admitting that the author had old Masonic charges to guide him. A very elaborate paper, which may be classed with the first of these views, has been written by Brother C.C. Howard of Picton, New Zealand, and he relies upon the fact that this new charge draws its inspiration from Roman Verulam and the erection of St. Albans by Offa, King of Mercia, circa 793, and that one Namas Graecus, under various spellings, is given as the teacher of Masonry in France. Offa is supposed by Brother Howard to have brought Masons from Nismes, or Nimes, in southern France for the purpose in view, hence the derivation of Namas Graecus. A theory such as that of Brother Howard would well account for all that is peculiar in this constitution. The present Nimes is a very ancient Greco-Roman town and has perfect remains of the work of their architects. Moreover, it was for 2 centuries in the hands of the Saracens until Charles Martel, who was the traditional patron of French Masons and the hammer of the Saracens, drove them out of that town and may then have appointed a duke or prince to rule it. The Cook manuscript, like the Strasbourg statutes, speak of Charles II, but this is an error, and it is noteworthy that the charges of David and Solomon are invariably united with the French patronage, proving that we derive these Masonic views from French sources. At whatever date these constitutions first appeared in this country, they eventually superseded the English version. The Saracens were large builders in the East, and even the mausoleum of Theodoric of Ravenna, erected in the 6th century, is considered by De Vogue to be the work of Syrian Masons brought forward by Byzantines. It is said that about the year 693, they assembled 12,000 stonecutters to build the Great Lamia at Damascus. The Tulun Mosque at Cairo, which was built in the 9th century, has all the main features of Gothic styles, and the same race erected numerous magnificent works in Spain. Gibbon informs us that between 813 and 833, the Moors brought into Spain all the literature which they could obtain in Constantinople, and that between 912 and 961, the most celebrated architects were invited from thence. We learn from a catalogue of the Escurial Library that they possessed 70 public libraries and that the manuscripts handed down includes translations from Greek and Latin and Arabic writers on philosophy, philology, jurisprudence, theology, mysticism, talismans, divination, agriculture, and other arts. They gave us astronomy, alchemy, arithmetic, algebra, Greek philosophy, papermaking, the pendulum, the mariner's compass, and our first notions of chivalry and armed fraternities. Whether they gave us Gothic architecture may be doubtful, but the durability of their own buildings is astounding, and Cordova, the seat of empire, covered a space 24 miles by 6 miles, even in the 8th and 9th centuries, and was filled with magnificent palaces and public edifices. Roger Bacon probably derived gunpowder through their intermediary. It is possible that Syrian fraternities of Masons continued to exist until its invasion by the Saracens, and they themselves, as we have seen, had secret fraternities analogous to Freemasonry. And as the Quran accepts the history of the Jewish patriarchs, such a system as we now possess is in accord with their feelings, and might possibly be acceptable to a French fraternity who were Christians and had derived building instructions from a Muslim race. If the Saracenic theory in regard to nismes is inadmissible, or the derivation of the French charges under Norman introduction, when the system had consolidated under the Sons of Solomon, there are two other views we may notice. The possibility of a derivation from the Spanish Moors, or through the Crusaders who returned from Palestine after erecting endless works with the assistance of the native Masons. Neither of these two views will account fully for the fact that the constitutions of the period of this chapter connect the charges of David and Solomon with the Namas Graecus, who had been at the building of Solomon's temple, with Charles Martel, or even Charles II. But this is not a great difficulty, for Namas does not appear until circa 1525, and was always a trouble to the copyists. Sometimes he is Namas, at others he is Aymon, or the man with a Greek name, and on one occasion he is Gracus. Again, building in Europe was a clerical art down to the 12th century, and laymen were subject to them, but the religion of the Saracens was of a different caste, and admitted from the very first of the continuance of independent schools of architecture attached to no Sheikh-ul-Islam, Mullah or Dervish. On the whole, we seem to be led by these considerations to the Norman-French introduction into this country of a species of Masonic rules, rites and legends which existed in southern France, and which were still further influenced in the 13th century by Masons from the East. But the reader can judge of this upon reading all the facts. When Abdur-Rahman built the great mosque of Cordova in the short space of 10 years, he said, "Let us raise to Allah a Jama Masjid, which shall surpass the temple raised by Suleiman himself at Jerusalem." This is the oldest comparison which we have of Solomon's erection as compared with medieval erections, and coming from a Muslim is eminently suggestive. Some 30 years ago, Brother Weiner Bedolf brought forward some cogent arguments to prove that though our craft masonry had been derived from the Roman colleges, the third degree of modern masonry had been added in its second half by Muslims. But as a matter of fact, the existing Jewish guilds have a ceremony from which our modern third degree is derived through the ancient guilds, and it is quite possible that the workmen of Abdur-Rahman found it of old date in Spain, as we shall see later, and that a guild of them was employed at Cordova. Mecca has had for ages a semi-Masonic society which claims its derivation from the Quraysh, who were guardians of the Kaaba, namely the Beni Ibrahim. For some hundreds of years, our constitutions have asserted that Nimrod was a Grand Master and gave the Masons a charge which we still follow. Its first degree is the builders of Babylon and is directed against Nimrod and his idols, and against idolatry in general. Its second degree is the brothers of the pyramids, and teaches, as do our own constitutions, that Abraham taught the Egyptians geometry and the mode of building the pyramids. The third degree is builders of the Kaaba, in which the three Grand Master Masons, Ibrahim, Ishmael and Isaac, erect the first Kaaba on the foundations of the temple erected by Seth on the plans of his father Adam. At the completion of the Kaaba, the 12 chiefs or assistants of the three Grand Masters are created Princes of Arabia. The society was clearly ancient in 600 AD, as Al-Quran alludes to the legendary basis on which it is formed. There is a very interesting French romance of the 12th century by Juan de Villeneuve, which seems to have a bearing upon the names of our old Masonic manuscripts, or at least on a corrupt version of them, and which moreover commemorates the Masonic death of a person who is supposed to have battled with the Saracens in France and Palestine. Either the work may veil legends of the compagnonnage, or, with less probability, these latter may have drawn something from it. This romance is entitled Les Quatre Fils Aymons. Charlemagne returns victorious from a long and bloody war against the Saracens in Easter 768 and has to listen to accusations against Prince Aymon of the Ardennes for failing to perform his fealty and not warring against the Saracens. Charlemagne has as colleagues Solomon of Bretagne and his trusty friend the Duke of Naismes. Renaud, Allard, Guichard and Richard, the four sons of Aymon, depart from the court in quest of adventure. They defeat Bourgon, the Saracen chief before Bordeaux, cause him to become a Christian, and after that restore Yon, king of Aquitaine, to his throne. Renaud marries his daughter Laura and erects the castle of Montauban. Yon fears the anger of Charlemagne, persuades the four Aymons to solicit his grace, and they set out with olive branches in their hands, but are treacherously waylaid by their enemies, and would have been slain but for the arrival of their cousin Maugy, and the cypress was changed for the palm. Richard is taken prisoner and condemned to death, but Maugis disguises himself as a pilgrim, hangs the executioner, carries off Richard, and also the golden crown and scepter of Charlemagne, who thereupon resolves to attack Montauban. After a due amount of battles, peace is restored on condition that Renaud departs on a pilgrimage to Palestine. On arrival there, he is surprised to meet Maugy, and between them they restore the old Christian king of Jerusalem to the throne. After an interval, Renaud is recalled to France, and on his arrival finds his wife dead of grief, as well as his aged father Aymon and his mother. His old antagonists, Naismes, Ogre and Roland, have been slain at Ronceveux. 5 years later, Charlemagne visits Aix-la-Chapelle with the three brothers Aymon and their two nephews, and the following is a literal translation of what occurred. "Hello," says the emperor to a good woman, "what means this crowd?" The peasant answered, "I come from the village of Crozon, where died 2 days ago a holy hermit who was tall and strong as a giant. He proposed to assist the Masons to construct at Cologne the Church of St. Peter. He maneuvered so well that the others, who were jealous of his ability, killed him in the night time whilst he slept, and threw his body into the Rhine, but it floated, covered with light. On the arrival of the bishop, the body was exposed in the nave, with uncovered face, that it might be recognized. Behold what it is that draws the crowd." The emperor approached and beheld Renaud of Montauban, and the three Aymons and 2 sons of Renaud mingled their tears over the corpse. Then the bishop said, "Console yourselves. He for whom you grieve has conquered the immortal palm." The emperor ordered a magnificent funeral and a rich tomb. In the translation of Caxton, it is the bishop who does this, and also canonizes him as Saint Renaud the Martyr. In the time of Charlemagne, and even much later, there existed a great number of pre-Christian and Gnostic rites, and the emperor is credited with reforming or establishing in Saxony the country of Aymon, whose memory was held in great veneration even down to the 19th century, a secret fraternity for the suppression of paganism, which has most of the forms of modern Freemasonry. Hargrave Jennings holds that the fleur-de-lis may be traced through the bees of Charlemagne to the scarab of Egypt, and is again found on the tiaras of the gods of Egypt and Chaldea. After the Culdi, Alcuin had assisted in building the Church of St. Peter at York. He went over to France and became a great favorite at court, having the instruction of the emperor himself, whom he terms a builder by the art of the most wise Solomon, who made him an abbot. Apart from the significance of this romance in a Masonic sense, which appears to have drawn on existing Masonry, there are some peculiar correspondences. The body of Osiris was thrown into the Nile, that of Renaud into the Rhine. The address of the bishop to the mourners is almost identical with that of the old hierophants to the mourners for the slain sun god. As before stated, the branch varied in the mysteries, as the erica, the ivy, the palm, the laurel, the golden bough. As in the case of the substituted victim for Richard, the Muslims held that a substitute was made for Jesus. The romance confuses the time of Charlemagne, if we accept it literally, with that of a Christian king of Jerusalem, as the Masonic manuscripts confuse the date of Charles of France with an apocryphal Aymon who was at the building of Solomon's temple. Possibly the Masons confused the Temple of Solomon with that existing one, which Cardinal Vitry and Mondeville inform us was called the Temple of Solomon, to distinguish the Temple of the Chivalry from that of Christ. They allude, of course, to the house of the Knights Templars. These legends may well represent some ancient tradition, and we know not what manuscripts have perished during the centuries. A curiously veiled pagan mythology may be traced in Paris, comparing Saint Denis to Dionysos. The death of Saint Denis takes place on Montmartre, that of Dionysos on Mount Parnassus. The remains of Denis are collected by holy women who consign them with lamentations to a tomb over which the beautiful abbey was erected. But he rises from his tomb like Dionysos, and replacing his severed head walks away. Over the southern gate of the abbey is also sculptured a sprig of the vine laden with grapes, which was a Dionysian symbol, and at the feet of the saint in other parts the panther is represented, whose skin was in use in the rites of the mysteries. Other attempts to identify Namas Graecus may be given. Brother Robert H. Murdoch, Major Royal Artillery, considers that this person is the Marcus Graecus from whose manuscript Bacon admits in De Nullitate Magiae 1216 that he derived the composition of gunpowder. There is one old manuscript in the early days of the Grand Lodge that has adopted this view. Here again we run against the Saracens, for Dutton shows that the Brahmins were acquainted with powder, from whom it passed to the Luli, or gypsies of Babylon, the Greeks and Saracens, and it is thought to have been used by the Arabs at the siege of Mecca in 690. Again, Peter Mexia shows that in 1343 the Moors used explosive shells against Alfonso XII of Castile, and a little later the gypsies were expert in making the heavy guns. Very little is known of Marcus Graecus, but early in the 9th century his writings are erroneously supposed to be mentioned by the Arabian physician Mesue. The acceptance of Marcus of gunpowder notoriety as identical with Namas, or Marcus of Masonic notoriety, necessitates one of two suppositions. One, either he was the instructor, or believed to be so, of Charles Martel in military erections. Two, the Fraternity of Masons had a branch devoted to the study of alchemy and the hidden things of nature and science. Much might be said in its favor, but unless there was some manuscript of a much earlier date that mentions Namas or Marcus and is missing, the introduction is probably only of the 16th century, when Masons were actually students of Masonry and the secret sciences. Another theory has been propounded by Brother Klein, Fellow of the Royal Society, the eminent past master of the Quatuor Coronati Lodge, namely that Harun al-Rashid's son, the Caliph al-Mamun, is the man with a Greek name. He shows that in the time of this caliph, the books of Euclid were translated into Arabic for the colleges of Cordova, and it was not until the 12th century that Abelard of Bath rendered them into Latin. The original Greek manuscript was lost for 700 years when it was found by Simon Grinius, a Swabian and co-laborer of Melanchthon and Luther. In 1530 he gave the manuscript to the world, and we actually find that in some of our manuscripts, Gracus is transformed into green, Greninois, Grenus, Grenaeus. Caxton printed the Four Sons of Aymon in the 15th century, and we find some scribes transforming Namas into Aymon. Here we have a later attempt to identify the personality mentioned. He was a man of whom nobody knew anything, and each scribe sought to develop his own idea, if he had any. Charlemagne was a contemporary of the Harun al-Rashid here mentioned, who sent him a sapphire ornament and chain by his ambassador. Green, in his short history of the English people, London 1876, says, "A Jewish medical school seems to have existed at Oxford. Abelard of Bath brought back a knowledge of mathematics from Cordova. Roger Bacon himself studied under the English rabbis." Page 83. Bacon himself writes, "I have caused youths to be instructed in languages, geometry, arithmetic, the construction of tables and instruments, and many needful things besides." The great work of this mendicant friar of the Order of St. Francis, the Opus Majus, is a reform of the methods of philosophy. But from grammar he passes to mathematics, from mathematics to experimental philosophy. Under the name of mathematics was enclosed all the physical science of the time. It is beyond doubt that after the Norman conquest in 1066, the predominant genius of Masonry was French. The oversight and the design were French, the labor Anglo-Saxon, but the latter was strong enough, as shown by an eminent architect, to transmit their own style in combination with that of the French. It must also be borne in mind that if the English towns have some claims to Roman succession, that feature is doubly strong in France, even to the language. Long after the conquest of the country by the Franks, and even until modern times, the people were allowed to continue Roman laws, privileges, colleges, and guilds. Pure Roman architecture exists to this day, and notably at Namas. Lodges, though not perhaps under that name, must have existed from the earliest times, for we find that in the 12th century the craft was divided into 3 divisions. We may even say 4, for besides the past masters' associations, there were apprentices, companions or journeymen, and perpetual companions, or a class who were neither allowed to take an apprentice or to begin business as masters. That is, they could employ themselves only on inferior work. The eminent historian of Masonry, Brother R.F. Gould, shows this, and also that the so-called Fraternities of France were the masters' associations, but that the companions and apprentices had to contribute to the funds that were necessary for their maintenance. The qualification necessary to obtain membership of this association was the execution of a masterpiece, which was made as expensive as possible in order to keep down the number of masters. It will be seen at once that this is a very different organization to the constitution of the assemblies of our last chapter. And the reader must keep this distinction in mind, as well as the fact that there came over to this country a class of men impressed with these discordant views. It would extend far beyond the scope of this book to give more than a very slight account of the numerous abbeys, monasteries, churches and castles which were erected after the Norman conquest. It is, however, necessary, in our inquiry after the speculative element, to say something of these and of the persons who erected them. Dr. James Anderson states that King William the Bastard employed Gundulf, Bishop of Rochester, and Earl Roger de Montgomery in building or extending the Tower of London, castles of Dover, Exeter, Winchester, Warwick, Hereford, Stafford, York, Durham, Newcastle, also Battle Abbey, St. Saviour's in Southwark, and 90 other pious houses, whilst others built 42 such and 5 cathedrals. Battle Abbey was in building 1067 to 1090, the architect being a Norman monk who was a noted arrowhead maker and therefore named William the Faber, or Smith. Between 1070 and 1130, Canterbury Cathedral was in course of erection. In 1076, Archbishop Thomas began the re-erection of the Cathedral of York, which had previously been burnt in contest with the Normans. Between 1079 and 1093, Winchester Cathedral was in progress. The white or square tower on the Thames is of this period, and Jennings mentions one of the main pillars, which has a volute on one side and a horn on the other, which he considers to have the same significance as the 2 pillars of Solomon's temple, that is symbolizing male and female. It is evident that Masons must have now been in great demand, and that whether Saxon or Norman were sure of employment. The following are of interest, and as we meet with any particulars which have a distinct bearing upon the Masonic organization, we will give them. The new castle, whence the name of that town is taken, was built by a son of the Bastard, and thenceforth became, as in Roman times, a place of great strength, and also the chief home of the monastic orders, for Benedictines, Augustinians, Carmelites, Franciscans, Hospitallers of St. John, and nuns all built houses here and their conventual buildings within its walls, and many an hospitium for wayfarers, many guilds, and many a chapel of black, white, and grey friars were founded. The Percys had a town residence here in the narrow street called the Close. In 1074, Lincoln Cathedral was begun by Remgius Fauchamp, the Norman bishop, who had it ready for consecration in 8 years. It was destroyed by fire in 1141, but Bishop Alexander restored it to more than its former beauty. Where the castle now stands existed an ancient fortress, which the Bastard converted into a Norman stronghold. In 1077, Robert the Cementarius, or Mason, had a grant of lands in reward for his skill in restoring St. Albans. And we may find in this circumstance the origin of the St. Alban charge combined with that of Charles Martel and David and Solomon, including the Norman fiction that St. Alban had for his Masonic instructor St. Amphibel out of France. We say fiction because Britain at that day sent Masons to Gaul. In Yorkshire, a Godefroy the Master Builder witnesses the Whitby Charter of Uchtred, the son of Gospatric. These are Danish names, and the marks of Yorkshire Masons in this and the following century are strong in the use of letters of the runic or Scandinavian alphabet. Baldwin, abbot of St. Edmunds, began a church in 1066, which was consecrated in 1095. Hermanus the monk compares it in magnificence to Solomon's Temple, which is the first Masonic reference we have to that structure, and in Norman times. Payne Peveril, a bastard son of the king, built a small round church at Cambridge which was consecrated in 1101, this form being a model of the Holy Sepulchre at Jerusalem. He also began a castle in Derbyshire on a peak inaccessible on three sides, one of which overlooks the Peak Cavern, which Faber supposes was used in the Druidical mysteries. A round church was erected at this period in Northampton, probably by Simon de Saint-Luce. An ancient sundial is built into its walls. The tooling of the building is Saxon chevron style, in contradistinction from the Norman diagonal axework. There is a curiously mystic monument at Brent Pelham to Piers Shonker, who died in 1086. Weaver calls it a stone whereon is figured a man, and about him an eagle, a lion and a bull having all wings, and an angel, as if they would represent the four evangelists. Under the feet of the man is a cross fleury. We must not hastily confound these emblems with the present quartering in the arms of Freemasons. During the reign of Rufus, the great palace of Westminster was built and 30 pious houses. In 1089, the king laid the foundation of St. Mary's Abbey at York. In the same year, the Bishop of Hereford laid the foundation of the Gothic cathedral at Gloucester, and it was consecrated in 1100. In 1093, William of Cariliffo, Bishop of Durham, laid the foundation of his cathedral in the presence of Malcolm, King of Scots, and Prior Turgot. Surtees says that it was on a plan which he had brought with him from France. In the same year, the church of the old Culdee settlement of Lindisfarne was erected, and Edward, a monk of Durham, acted as architect. In 1093, Hugh Lupus, Earl of Chester, sent for Anselm, Abbot of Bec, by his conseil to build the Abbey of St. Werburgh at Chester. It contains an old pulpit of black oak which is full of heraldic carving which has been mistaken for Masonic emblems. It was in this monastery that Ralph Higden compiled the Polychronicon, a history often referred to in the Cook manuscript. The work of Durham Cathedral was continued by Bishop Ranulph de Flambard from 1104 and completed before the year 1129. Under Bishop William de Cariloff, the grant which Waltheof, Earl of Northumberland, had made to the See of Durham was confirmed of the Priory of Tynemouth to the Church of Jarrow, which was built by Benedict Biscop in 689 and of Wearmouth 8 years later. Also, Robert de Mowbray brought monks from St. Albans to rebuild the Priory Church, which was completed in 1110. Anything connected with these northern provinces is Masonically important, for Northumberland and Durham had many operative lodges long prior to the Grand Lodge of 1717, and any legitimacy which that body can have it owes to those northern lodges which eventually joined its ranks. Northumberland is studded with fortified piles or towers and fortified vicarages which must have given much employment to masons. Elsdon possessed one of these and also 2 folkmote hills, where in old time justice was administered in the open air, as in the Vame of Westphalia, dating back 1,000 years. Oswald, the good Bishop of Salisbury, built the Church of St. Nicholas at Newcastle about the year 1004. In 1115, Henry I made grants to the canons regular of Carlisle. Many parts of the Church of St. Andrew are earlier than St. Nicholas, but its erection is of later date. The Church of St. Mary, Beverley, is supposed to have had upon its site a chapel of ease dedicated to St. Martin by Archbishop Thurston of York between 1114 and 1142. It is certain, however, that it was constituted a vicarage of St. Mary in 1325. The nave was built about 1450 and consists of 6 bays and 7 clear-story windows. But in 1530, the upper part of the central tower fell upon the nave with much loss of life. Its pillar was erected by the Guild of Minstrels, which, like that of the Masons, claimed to date from Saxon times. It has upon the fluted cornices 5 figures of the minstrels with their instruments, of which only 2 respectively with guitar and pipe are intact, and stands on the north side facing the pulpit. The misere stalls in the chancel are of the 15th century, with carved bas reliefs under the seats. One of these represents a fox shot through the body with a woodman's arrow, and a monkey approaching with a bottle of physic. In regard to symbolism, Brother George Oliver, Doctor of Divinity, mentions an old church at Chester, which he does not name, containing the double equilateral triangles, also the same in the window of Lichfield Cathedral. Mr. Goodwin states that the triple triangles interlaced may be seen in the tower of a church in Sussex. We are now approaching the period of the Crusades, and it may be noticed that Cluny and other great French abbeys are usually considered the centres of action whence proceeded the builders that accompanied the armies of the cross to Palestine. Here, an enormous number of buildings were erected between 1148 and 1189, in which Europeans directed native workmen, and in which the former learned a lighter style of architecture which resulted in pointed Gothic, a style which had early existence in the East, for Professor T. Hayter Lewis points out that the 9th century mosque at Toulon in Cairo has every arch pointed, every pier squared, and every capital enriched with leaf ornament. This style the returned masons began to construct and superintend in the West. Mr. Wyatt Papworth mentions that a bishop of Utrecht in 1199 obtained the Arcane Magisterium in laying the foundation of a church, and that he was slain by a master mason whose son had betrayed the secret to the bishop. About this time was begun the old church at Brownsover near Rugby. When it was restored in 1876, 2 skeletons were found under the north and south walls, in spaces cut out of the solid clay and covered over with the oak blocks of 2 carpenters' benches. A similar discovery was made in Holsworthy Parish Church in 1885. In this case, the skeleton had a massive mortar over the mouth, and the stones were huddled about the corpse, as if to hastily cover it over. There is no doubt that in this and many other cases, the victims were buried alive as a sacrifice. They are instances in proof of a widespread and ancient belief of a living sacrifice being necessary. King Henry I, 1100 to 1135, built the palaces of Woodstock and Oxford and 14 pious houses, whilst others built 100 such, besides castles and mansions. The Bishop of Durham confirmed and granted privileges to the Halley workfolk, who would be Saxon artificers. In 1113, Joffrid, Abbot of Croyland, laid the foundation of that abbey. About 22 stones were laid by patrons who gave money or lands. Arnold is described as a lay brother of the art of masonry, a most scientific master. About this time, or a little earlier, the 7 liberal arts and sciences are designated the trivium and quadrivium, and the chronicler gives us the following illustration of the first division. During this time, Odo read lessons in grammar to the younger sort, Teric logic to the elder students at noon, and William rhetoric in the afternoon, whilst Gilbert preached every Sunday in different churches in French and Latin against the Jews, and on holiday evenings explained the scriptures to the learned and clergy. In Essex's Bibliotheca Topographia, 1783, volume 4, we find it stated that the builders of this portion cut rudely at the west end of the south aisle a pair of compasses, a Lewis, and 2 circular figures, which he supposes are intended for sun and moon. In 1427, however, there were repairs in progress, not of this part, but in the west and north aisles. This abbey possessed a library of 900 books, and save that Joffrid or Gilbert exhibited so much animosity against the Jews, is so consonant with the first part of the Cook manuscript that we might have taken it as a proof that the Semitic rites existed in 1113. They probably did in France and parts of Spain. The bronze candelabrum of Gloucester was made in 1115 and has the double triangles and much other Masonic symbolism. It is of Byzantine design and approximates to old Egyptian work and symbolism. King Stephen, 1135 to 1154, employed Gilbert de Clare to build 4 abbeys, 2 nunneries, and the Church of St. Stephen at Westminster, whilst others built about 90 pious houses. Jesus College at Cambridge was founded in this reign, and a very remarkable church was erected at Adel near Leeds. It is recorded of a soldier of King Stephen named Owen or Tyndall that he received a species of religious initiation at the Culdee Monastery in Donegal, placed in a pastos of the cell. He then went on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, and on his return, as has been recorded of Renaud of Montauban, assisted in building the Abbey of Bosmagovsich. The marks of Birkenhead Priory of this date have been collected and printed by Brother W. H. Rylands, also those of St. John's Church in Chester, the Cathedral, Chester, and the walls, some of which are Roman work. In 1147, Henry de Lacy laid the foundation of Kirkstall Abbey in Yorkshire. It is of pointed Gothic. Roche Abbey was built between this date and 1186, and these two are believed to be by the same architect. Rievaulx and Fountains Abbey were begun in 1199 and 1200. At this time, Adam, a monk of Fountains Abbey, and previously of Whitby, was celebrated for his knowledge of Gothic architecture, and officiated at the building of the abbeys of Meur, Woburn, and Kirkstead. It is not said whether he was lay or cleric. York Cathedral was again destroyed by fire in 1137, and Archbishop Roger began to re-erect it in 1154. In Normandy, the guilds were travelling about like those of England, and were of importance in 1145 and had a guild union when they went to Chartres. At this time, Hugues, Archbishop of Rouen, wrote to Theodoric of Amiens informing him that numerous organized companies of Masons resorted thither under the headship of a chief-designated prince, and that the same companies on their return are reported by Aymons, abbot of Saint-Pierre-sur-Dive, to have restored a great number of churches in Rouen. The priory of St. Mary in Furness was commenced by Benedictines from Savigny. In 1179, the priory of Lanercost was founded by Robert de Valibus, Baron of Gilsland. Bishop Hugh de Pudsey rebuilt the Norman castle of Durham, dating from 1092 to 1174. Between 1153 and 1194, this prelate was the great transitional builder of the north, and he began the erection of a new church at Darlington in 1180, on the site of an old Saxon one. The great hall of the castle of Durham was the work of Bishop Hadfield in the reign of Richard III on an older Norman one. Henry II, between 1154 and 1189, built 10 pious houses, whilst others built 100 such. It is the era of the advent of the transitional Gothic. In the first year of this king's reign, 1155, the poor fellow soldiers of Jesus Christ and of the Temple of Solomon began to build their temple in Fleet Street, London, and continued at work till 1190. It is a round church in pointed Gothic to which a rectangular one was added later. By papal bull of 1162, these knights were declared free of all tithes and imposts in respect of their movables and immovables, and their serving brethren had like favours, indulgences, and apostolic blessings. James of Vitry says that they had a very spacious house in Jerusalem, which was known as the Temple of Solomon, to distinguish the temple of the chivalry from the temple of the Lord. In the rule which Bernard, abbot of Clairvaux, drew up for them, he speaks of the poverty of the knights and says of their house that it could not rival the world-renowned Temple of Solomon. In chapter 30, he again speaks of the poverty of the house of God and of the Temple of Solomon. As a fraternity, he designates them valiant Maccabees. Sir John Maundeville visited the house and speaks of it in 1356 thus: "Near the temple of Christ on the south is the temple of Solomon, which is very fair and well polished. And in that temple dwell the knights of the temple, called Templars, and that was the foundation of their order, so that knights dwelt there, and canons regular in the temple of our Lord." As Masonic symbolism is found in their preceptories, this would be a channel from which to deduce both our Solomonic legends and the alleged papal bulls, which Sir William Dugdale asserted were granted to travelling Freemasons. But this view has never met with favour from Masonic historians, who aim chiefly at writing things agreeable to their patrons and rulers. Brother Oliver states that the high altar has the double triangles. At any rate, these appear on the modern embroidered cover. There is the anchor of the Virgin, also the boson of black and white, which Vitry interprets that they are fair to their friends, but black to their enemies. But Jennings says, "This grandly mystic banner is Gnostic, and refers to the mystic Egyptian apothegm that light proceeded from darkness." He further mentions these symbols in the spandrels of the arches of the long church: the boson, paschal lamb on a red cross, the lamb with a red cross, standard triple cloven, a prolonged cross issuing out of a crescent moon having a star on each side. The arches abound with stars from which issue wavy or crooked flames. The winged horse, white on a red field, is one of their badges. He adds that there is a wealth of meaning in every curve of the tombs which appear in the circular portion. Ireland has many works erected during this period, and Mr. Street says of them, "I find in these buildings the most unmistakable traces of their having been erected by the same men who were engaged at the same time in England and Wales." The same remark will apply to Scotland. The ancient preceptory of the temple at Paris contained, says Atlanta, volume 11, page 337, 24 columns of silver which supported the audience chamber of the Grand Master, and the chapel hall, paved in mosaic and enriched by woodwork of cedar of Lebanon, contained 60 huge vases of gold. The fortress was partially destroyed in 1779. Batissier, in his Elements of Archaeology, Paris, 1843, says that the name Magister de Lapidibus Vivis was given in the Middle Ages to the chief artist of a confraternity, Master of Living Stones, or the person was simply termed Magister Lapidum, and he refers on both these points to some statutes of the Corporation of Sculptors quoted by Father de Laval. For the origin of the first of these terms, consult the apocryphal books of Hermas. But the term has more in it than appears on the surface, for in guild ceremonial, the candidate had to undergo the same treatment as the stone, wrought from the rough to the perfect. Amateurs were received, for the 1260 Charte octroyée is quoted by the Bishop of Bâle thus: "The same conditions apply to those who do not belong to the métier and who desire to enter the fraternity." A priory of the Clunic order of monks was founded in 1161 at Dudley by Gervase Pagnell, and they had others at Lewes, Castlelaker, and Bermondsey. A fire having occurred at Canterbury, Gervasius, a Benedictine monk, in 1174, consulted French and English artificers who disagreed in regard to the repair of the structure. The account which Gervase gives is highly interesting and instructing. The work was given to William of Sens, a man active, ready, and skillful both in wood and stone. He delivered models for shaping the stones to the sculptors. He reconstructed the choir and made 2 rows of 5 pillars on each side. But in the 5th year, he was so injured by the fall of his scaffold that he had to appoint as deputy a young monk as overseer of the masons. When he found it necessary to return to France, the masons were left to the oversight of William the Englishman, a man small in body but in workmanship of many kinds, acute and honest. The nave was completed in 1180, and Gervase informs us that in the old structure everything was plain and wrought with an axe, but in the new exquisitely sculptured with a chisel. We gather 2 points of information from this account of 1160. First, we have the information that William of Sens issued models to the workmen, which explains a law of the Masonic manuscripts that no master should give mold or rule to one not a member of the society. We see in the second place that the chisel was superseding the axe. We will also mention here that there is charter evidence of this century that Christian the Mason and Lambert the Marble Mason had lands from the Bishop of Durham for services rendered. The fall of Jerusalem in 1187 brought back from the east many artisans to the west, whose influence is traceable in the early pointed style, or as it is termed, the lancet or early English. A noteworthy movement, which extended to other countries, had place in France at this period. A shepherd of the name of Benezet conceived the idea of building a bridge over the Rhône at Avignon. The bishop supported his scheme and superintended its erection between 1171 and 1188. Upon Benezet's death in 1184, Pope Clement III canonized him and sanctioned a new fraternity of Frères Pontives, bridge builders. In 1189, Fitz-Alwine, Mayor of London, held his first assize, from which we learn that the master carpenters and masons of the city were to be sworn not to prejudice the ancient rites ordained of the estates of the city. Between 1189 and 1204, Bishop Lacy was engaged in adding to Winchester Cathedral. There are references worthy of note in Scotland at this time. In 1190, Bishop Jocelyn obtained a charter from William the Lion to establish a fraternity to assist in raising funds wherewith to erect the Cathedral of Glasgow. It is supposed to imply the existence of a band of travelling masons. The same bishop undertook the erection of the Abbey of Kilwinning. The Templar preceptory of Red Abbey Stead was erected at the same time, and an ancient lodge of masons existed here last century. In the reign of John, 1200 to 1216, about 40 pious houses were erected. Hugh, Bishop of Lincoln, about 1200, wrought with his own hands at the choir and transept of the cathedral, the designs being by Gaufres de Noir, constructor ecclesiae. The masons' marks are numerous, and it is asserted by Brother Emre Holmes that from the central tower may be seen 3 large figures of a monk, a nun, and an angel, each displaying one of the signs of the 3 degrees of Masonry. The cathedral has also an ancient stained glass window, which has the double triangles in 4 out of 6 spaces, an engraving of which appears in the historical landmarks of Brother George Oliver. Brother Fort asserts that the Masons of the Middle Ages must have received their technical education from the priories, and that a tendency continually reveals itself to use the abstruse problems of geometry as the basis of philosophical speculations, thus blending the visible theorems with unseen operations of the spirit. He considers that the building operations of the Masons were canvassed in the lodge and worked out mathematically, the plan of the building serving as the basis of instruction. These views mean in 2 words that Masonry in all times was operative and speculative, but the identical system prevails today in some still existing stone masons' guilds. In 1202, Godfrey de Lucy, Bishop of Winchester, formed a fraternity for repairing his church during the 5 years ensuing. There is nothing to disclose the nature of these fraternities. It may mean no more than a committee for collecting the means. Possibly the Masters' Fraternities of the French may have given the idea. At this period, Gilbert de Eversolde was laboring at St. Albans Abbey as the architect, and Hugh de Goldcliffe is called a deceitful workman. In 1204, the Abbey of Beaulieu-in-Hens was founded by King John, and Durandus, a master employed on the Cathedral of Rouen, came over to it by request. In 1209, London Bridge, which was begun by Peter de Colechurch, was completed. There is a slab of this period in the transept of Martin Church, West Riding, Yorkshire, which has upon it a Calvary cross, a cross-hilted sword, and a mason's square and level pointing to the union of arms, religion and art. In 1212, a second assize was held in London by Mayor Fitz-Alwine, when owing to a great fire it was thought necessary to fix the wages. At this time a horse or cow could be bought for 4 shillings. Masons were granted 3 pence per day with food, or 4.5 pence without. Labourers had 1.5 pence or 3 pence. Cutters of freestone, 2.5 pence or 4 pence. The terms used are sementarii and sculptores lapidum liberorum. John died in 1216, and Matthew of Paris and others write his epitaph. Who mourns or shall ever mourn the death of King John? Hell with all its pollutions is polluted by the soul of John. In the reign of Henry III, 1216 to 1272, 32 pious houses were erected, and the Templars built their Domus Dei at Dover. The beginning of this king's reign is the period when laymen, emancipating themselves from the monasteries, come to the front as builders and leaders of working masons. It is also the commencement of a more highly finished style of pointed Gothic introduced by the Masons who returned from Palestine. During this reign flourished the celebrated friar Roger Bacon, who, as member of a sworn fraternity, gave himself to the investigation of the hidden things of nature and science. In the reign of Henry III, the monks of Tynemouth raised a masterpiece of architecture in their new conventual church, which they completed by 1220, and were engaged in constant contention with the claims to jurisdiction of the bishops of Durham, and then followed disputes with the burgesses of Newcastle, owing to the monks fostering the trade of North Shields. The prior's officers were in the habit of meeting those of the common law on the hill of Gateshead, or beneath a spreading oak in Northumberland, when they came to hold assizes in Newcastle. In 1220, the foundation of Salisbury Cathedral was laid by Bishop Poore. Robert was master mason, and Helias de Berham, one of the canons, employed himself on the structure. Its base is the Patriarchal Cross. Its erection occupied 38 years, and it is the only Gothic cathedral in England built in one style of architecture. The 5-pointed star is found in the tracery of the arcades and heads of 32 windows, and the equilateral triangle is the basic design of the parapet. In 1220, Peter, Bishop of Winchester, levelled the footstone of Solomon's porch in Westminster Abbey. He is the same person as Peter de Rupibus, a native of Poitiers, who served with Coeur de Lion in Palestine and was knighted by him, created Bishop of Winchester in 1204, Chief Justice in 1214, went on a pilgrimage to Palestine and returned in 1231. Amongst his architectural labours is a Dominican convent in Winchester, the Abbey of Pitchfield, part of Netley Abbey, a pious house at Joppa, and the Domus Dei in Portsmouth. He died in 1238, and his effigy, which is a recumbent figure in Winchester Cathedral, has the right hand on the left breast and his left hand clasping a book. From 1233 to 1257, the close rolls give numerous details of the king's masons who were employed at Guildford, Woodstock and Westminster. In 1253, the king had consultations with masons, Franci et Angli. It is also the period of origin of the geometrical style. There is a document of 1258 which, though French, has an important bearing on English Masonic legends, referring amongst other things to Charles Martel, and which, though traditional, was accepted as sufficient to secure important freedoms. In this year, Stephen Boileau, Provost of the Corporation of Paris, compiled a code of regulations concerning the arts and trades of Paris, based upon the statements of the masters of guilds, and amongst these we find the following in regard to the Masons, which gives them a double title to the term free, for they were freestone cutters and free of certain duties. 21. The masons, macons, and plasterers are obliged to do guard duty and pay taxes and render such other services as the other citizens of Paris owe to their king. 22. The mortar makers are free of guard duty, as also every stonecutter since the time of Charles Martel, as the ancients, prud'hommes or wise men, have heard from father to son. The question arises here whether masons and setters, who were not free of duty, though cutters and sculptors were, used the term Carolus Secundus in England as a claim for the masons and setters. The prud'hommes were the wardens under the master who rules the craft, and we are further told that this master had taken his oath of service at the palace and afterwards before the provost of Paris. It is also said that after 6 years' service, the apprentice appeared before the master who keeps the craft, in order to swear by the saints to conform to craft usage. He thus became a journeyman or companion, but could not become a master and undertake the entire erection of a building until he had completed such a masterpiece as was appointed him and which entailed much outlay. But if this was passed, he became a member of the master's fraternity. The difference between the Saxon and the French custom appears to be this: that whilst in the former case the acceptance of a master rested with the same assembly as that to which the journeyman belonged, in the latter case the master's fraternity was now a separate body with independent laws. The custom of Montpellier, according to documents printed by Brother R.F. Gould, would seem to have developed somewhat differently. Here, after an apprentice had served 3 years, he was placed for another 4 years to serve as a journeyman under a master. At the end of this period, he might present his masterpiece, and if it was approved, he took the oath to the provosts, and only such sworn master was permitted to erect a building from the basement, but it was allowable for a journeyman to undertake small repairs. Thus, as city customs varied, confusion must at times have arisen in journeying abroad. There is mention in 1287, when the Cathedral of Uppsala in Sweden was begun, that Etienne de Bonneuil took with him from Paris 10 master masons and 10 apprentices. Possibly some of the masters or some of the apprentices were what we call fellows, but there is nothing to warrant any classification. It is important to show the secret nature and the import of the French organization and fraternities, and we quote the following from Brother J.G. Findle's History of Freemasonry. The fraternities existing as early as the year 1189 were prohibited by the Council of Rouen, and the same was most clearly expressed at the Council of Avignon in the year 1326, where it is said that the members of the fraternity met annually, bound themselves by oath mutually to love and assist each other, wore a costume, had certain well-known and characteristic signs and countersigns, and chose a president, Myram, whom they promised to obey. Nothing very vile in this. In 1242, Prior Melsonby made additions to Durham Cathedral, and others were made by Bishop Farnham before 1247, and by Prior Houghton about 1290. At Newcastle, the Church of All Saints was founded before 1296, and that of St. John in the same century. The Church of St. Nicholas was rebuilt in the 14th century, but the present tower only dates from the time of Henry VI. Clavel says that the seal of Irvin de Steinbach, Chief Master of Cologne, 1275, bears the square and compasses with the letter G. Turning to the north of England, we find that at York in 1171, 1127, 1241 and 1291, the choir, south transept and nave of the minster were either completed or in course of erection, and the workmanship is infinitely superior to later portions of the building. In 1270, the new church of the Abbey of St. Mary in York was begun by the Abbot Simon de Warwick, who was seated in a chair with a trowel in his hand and the whole convent standing around him. There is also a deed of 1277 with the seal of Walter Dixey, Sementarius de Bernuel, which conveys lands to his son Lawrence. The legend is S. Walter le Mazoun, surrounding a hammer between a half moon and a five-pointed star. In this same year, 1277, Pope Nicholas II is credited with letters patent to the Masons confirming the freedoms and privileges said to have been granted by Boniface IV in 614. If such a bull was issued, it has escaped discovery in recent times. In these somewhat dry building details, it will have been noticed that references are made to French designers and to consultation with French and English masons, and with this enormous amount of building there must necessarily have been a constant importation of French masons, with the introduction of French customs. On the symbolism of this period, there are some interesting particulars in the rationale of Bishop Durandus, who died in 1296. The tiles signify the protectors of the church, the winding staircase, imitated from Solomon's temple, the hidden knowledge. The stones are the faithful, those at the corners being most holy. The cement is charity. The squared stones, holy and pure, have unequal burdens to bear. The foundation is faith. The roof charity, the door obedience, the pavement humility, the four side walls justice, fortitude, temperance, prudence. Hence the Apocalypse saith, the city lieth foursquare. The custom is Hindu, French, British. In a paper recently read before one of the learned societies, Professor T. Hayter Lewis has shown that the builders of the early pointed Gothic of the 13th century were of a different school to those who preceded them in the 12th century. He shows that the mason's marks, the style, and the methods of tooling the stones differ from the older work, and whilst the older was wrought with diagonal tooling, the later was upright with a claw adze. He traces these changes in methods and marks through Palestine to Phoenicia. This new style, he considers, was brought into this country by masons who had learned it amongst the Saracens. And though masons' marks were in use in this country long before they were now further developed on the Eastern system, there is as well tangible evidence of the presence of Oriental masons in this country. Two wooden effigies, said to be of the time of the Crusades, were formerly in the manor house of Woburn in Buckinghamshire, of which drawings were shown to the Society of Antiquaries in 1814, and have recently been engraved in Ars Quatuor Coronatorum. These effigies are life-size. One represents an old man with quadrant and staff, the other a young man with square and compasses, and the attire, headdress, and even features indicate Asiatic originals. It has been thought that the Moorish Alhambra at Granada indicates the presence of Persian masons, and we find the translator of Tasso's Jerusalem Delivered in every case substitutes the word Macon for Mohammed, but this is only a provincial abbreviation for Maometto. Though supported in a superior manner, the theory of Professor Hayter Lewis is not new to Freemasonry. As in the 17th century, Sir William Dugdale, Sir Christopher Wren and others fix upon the reign of King Henry III as the period when the Society of Freemasons was introduced into England by travelling masons, protected by papal bulls. And Wren is said to have added his belief that pointed Gothic was of Saracenic origin, and that the bands resided in huts near the erection upon which they were working, and had a warden over every 10 men. But Elias Ashmole held that while such a reorganization actually took place, it was upon a Roman foundation. Dugdale probably derived his views from some monastic document or tradition, whilst Ashmole, as a Mason with better information, followed the old manuscript constitutions, as we have done in these chapters. Brother Gould is of opinion that the alleged bulls were given to the Benedictines and other monkish fraternities who were builders, and that they only apply to Masons as members, or lay brothers of the monasteries, and we may add, Templars. It must be clear to all who have eyes to see that with this importation into England of the foreign element, a new series of legends were engrafted upon the original simple account of the old English Masons. Such are the charges of Nimrod, of David and Solomon, and of Charles Martel, and though we have no manuscripts of this period to confirm us, there is no doubt that they are of this period. Equally, we have no contemporary text of the charges by which the newly imported Masons were ruled. The information already given enables us to see that there was a difference both in legends and laws between the two elements, and that it was a sectarian difference. English manuscripts of more modern date refer to books of charges, where those of Nimrod, of Solomon, of St. Alban, and of Athelstan are included, and if they actually existed, as we see no reason to doubt, they were of this century. Moreover, the references to Carolus Secundus or to Charles Martel must be of this period, though there can be no doubt that this refers to Carolus Magnus or Charlemagne, as small importations of French Masons in Saxon times would not have influenced the older legends, nor stood a chance of adoption by the English. In regard to the laws by which the French Masons were governed, we are, however, informed in the more modern manuscripts that they differed but little or were found all one with the Roman, British and Saxon charges. It is very evident that the early foreign element had a charge of their own referring to Nimrod, David, Solomon and Charles of France, applicable to their own ceremonies, and that in England they united therewith the charges of Euclid, St. Alban and Athelstan in a heterogeneous manner, and these are found in 2 or more manuscripts to which we refer later as having been approved by King Henry VI and afterwards made the general law. There is one piece of evidence which might enable us to settle certain difficult points if we could rely upon it. Professor Marx, a learned Jew, has stated that he saw in one of the public libraries of this country a commentary upon the Quran of the 14th century, written in the Arabic language, with Hebrew characters referring according to his view to Freemasonry, and which contained an anagrammatical sentence of which each line has one of the letters M-O-C-H, and which he reads, "We have found our Lord Hiram, Chiram." But the dervish sects have a similar phrase which would read, "We have found in our Lord rest, Kerim or Cherim." We must therefore hold our minds in reserve until the book has been refound and examined. In any case, it seems to add a link to the chain of evidence as to the Oriental origin of our present rites. We may feel assured that the Masons who returned from the Holy Land were of a class calculated to make a marked impression on the society. The word to which the foregoing alludes in modern Arabic might be translated child of the strong one. Several modern writers, both Masons and non-Masons, hold to the opinion that there were 2 artists at the building of Solomon's temple: Huram the Abiv, who began the work, and Hiram the son, who completed what his father had to leave undone. Succoth, where the brass ornaments for the temple were cast, signifies booths or lodges, and Isaradatha means sorrow or trouble. Josephus says that Hiram was son of a woman of the tribe of Naphtali, and that his father was of the Israelites. The account that we have of him in the Bible is that he was expert in dyeing and in working in gold and in brass, which makes him a chemist and metallurgist rather than a mason. There were many arts in which the ancients were our superiors. A very important lecture on this point has recently appeared from the pen of the Reverend Brother M.C. Rosenbaum. After this long digression, we will return to architecture in general. Mr. Wyatt Papworth points out the use of the term ingeniator in various documents between 1160 and 1300, referring to castles repaired or constructed. Some of these were undoubtedly architects and not engineers, whose duties were the construction of warlike machines. And though gunpowder had not yet come into use in this country, the connection with masoning might, at a later period, lead to the introduction of Namas Graecus into our manuscripts. In the reign of Edward I, 1272 to 1307, Merton College in Oxford, the Cathedral of Norwich and 20 pious houses were founded. The noble Gothic style had reached its climax. Between 1291 and 1294, several crosses were erected, and there are mentions of masons who were employed by the king. Some items of expense refer to timber, to make a lodge for Master Michael and his masons. Peter de Cavallini designed the Eleanor crosses. The one in Cheapside was begun by Richard de Crumble and completed by Roger de Crumble. It was of 3 stories, decorated with niches having statues executed by Alexander the Imaginator. A still more beautiful one was the Charing Cross. From 1290 to 1300, West Kirkby Church was building, and the marks are recorded by Brother Rylands as well as those of Eastham and Sefton churches. In 1300, Henry the monk, surnamed Latham Latimus, mason or stonecutter, rebuilt part of the Abbey of Evesham. In 1303, the mayor and 24 aldermen of London made ordinances for the regulation of the carpenters, masons and labourers. The mayor was Gregory de Roxley, and the masoons mestre, or master masons, and master carpenters are mentioned in conjunction with their servants. From 1308 to 1326, William Boyden was employed in erecting the Chapel of the Virgin at the Abbey of St Albans. In the reign of Edward II, 1307 to 1327, Exeter and Oriel colleges in Oxford, Clare Hall in Cambridge, and 8 pious houses were built. During this king's reign, we have the advent of the curvilinear or decorated style, which held its ground for near a century. In 1313, the Knights Templars were suppressed with great brutality in France. In England, their property was confiscated to the Knights of St John, their leading preceptories being at London, Warwick, Walsden, Lincoln, Lindsay, Bolingbroke, Widine, Aggerstone, York, Temple Sowerby, Cambridge, etc. They were distributed throughout the monasteries or joined the Knights of St John. Those of York had lenient treatment by Archbishop Greenfield and were relegated to St Mary's adjacent to the Culdee Hospital of St Leonard. Their lay brethren, amongst whom would be a numerous body of Masons, were liberated, a circumstance from which might spring more than a traditional connection. Some of the knights returned to lay occupations, and even married to the great annoyance of the Pope. In Scotland, the knights, aided in their aims by the wars between that country and England, retained their preceptories, and though they seem to have united with the Order of St John in 1465, they were as often distinguished by one name as the other. The Burgh Laws of Stirling have the following in 1405: "Than na Templar sol intromet with any merchandise or goods pertaining to the gilde, be buying and selling within or without their own lands, but gif he be any gilde brother," thus implying that the knights had actual membership with the guilds. The Templars, at the like date 1460, are mentioned in Hungary. In Portugal, their innocence of the charges brought against them was accepted, but to please the Pope, their name was changed to Knights of Christ. In an old Hungarian town where the Templars once were, the arms are a wheel on which is the Baptist's head on a charger. A bishop of Durham, circa 1295 to 1300, named Becker, had required more than the accustomed military service from the tenants of St Cuthbert, who pleaded the privileges of Halliwork folk, not to march beyond the Tees or Tyne, and Surtees explains that Halliwork folk, or holy work people, whose business, to wit, was to defend the holy body of St Cuthbert, in lieu of all other service, are here alluded to, but of Culdee original the term implied an art origin. Sir James Dalrymple, speaking of Scotland, says, "The Culdees continued till the beginning of the 14th century, up to which time they contended for their ancient rights, not only in opposition to the whole power of the primacy, but the additional support of papal authority. Noted lodges exist from old times at Culdee seats, such as Kilwinning, Melrose, Aberdeen, and as the period when this was shown was that of the suppression of the Templars. And the Scotch generally never allowed themselves to be pope-ridden. We have one reason why the name of Templar was continued in that country. There was everywhere a growing discontent against the Church of Rome, secretly indicated, even in the art of the Masonic sodalities. Isaac Disraeli alludes to it in his Curiosities of Literature. In his chapter entitled Expression of Suppressed Opinion, he states that sculptors and illuminators shared these opinions, which the multitude dare not express, but which the designers embodied in their work. Wolfius in 1300 mentions, as in the Abbey of Fulda, the picture of a wolf in a monk's cowl preaching to a flock of sheep, and the legend, "God is my witness, how I long for you all in my bowels." A cushion was found in an old abbey on which was embroidered a fox preaching to a flock of geese, each with a rosary in its mouth. On the stonework and columns of the great church at Argentine, as old as 1300, were sculptured wolves, bears, foxes, and other animals carrying holy water, crucifixes and tapers, and other things more indelicate. In a magnificent illuminated chronicle of Froissart is inscribed several similar subjects. a wolf in a monk's cowl stretching out its paw to bless a cock, a fox dropping beads which a cock is picking up. In other cases, a pope, we hope Clement V, is being thrust by devils into a cauldron and cardinals are roasting on spits. He adds that at a later period, the Reformation produced numerous pictures of the same class in which each party satirized the other. Over the entrance to the Church of St. Genevieve, says James Grant in Captain of the Guard, chapter 33, at Bommel is the sculpture of a mitred cat preaching to 12 little mice. There is a somewhat indecent carving at Stratford upon Avon. The Incorporated Society of Science, Letters and Art, in its Journal of January 1902, contains a paper by Mr. T. Tyndall Wildbridge upon the ideographic ornamentation of Gothic buildings. He observes that there were Masons who possessed the tradition of ancient symbolic formula, and that whilst the Olympic mythology is almost ignored, the subject being by them derived from the zodiacal system, and it is, he observes, that this symbolization, often satirical, holds place on equal terms with the acknowledged church emblems. He instances some of these at Oxford and elsewhere, one of which is the symbol of Horus in his shell, and in a second instance reproduced as a fox with a bottle of holy water. The altar of the Church of Doberen in Mecklenburg exhibits the priests grinding dogmas out of a mill. In 1322, Alan de Walsingham restored Ely, himself planning and working at the building. The 1322 will of Magister Simon le Maçon of York is printed in the Sûreté Society's collection. Of 1325 is the tomb of Sir John Croke and Lady Aline, his wife, at Wesley Wanterleys in Cambridgeshire. Upon it is the letter N with a hammer above it and a half moon and six-pointed star on each side. The N is an old Mason's mark and also a pre-Christian Persian symbol. Of this period there is a stone coffin lid at Thornton Abbey in Lincolnshire, which has upon it a shafted floriated Greek cross, and beside the shaft a square, religion and art united. A similar one occurs at Blidworth in Northamptonshire, having upon it a square and axe. At Halsall in Lancashire is a three-step cross, on one side of which is a square, and on the other an ordinary set square. There is also in Lincoln Cathedral a gravestone of this century representing Ricardus de Gainsbourg Sementarius or Mason, on each side of whom is a trowel and a square. Chartres Cathedral in France has a window containing the working tools of masons. Mr. Wyatt Papworth observes that at the end of the 13th century and beginning of the 14th, there is mention of the Magister Sementarii and his socii or fellows. There is documentary evidence of the term Freemason in 1376, and it may have been in use at an earlier date. Brother F. Schnittger argues on the evidence of a Nuremberg work of 1558 that the prefix indicates a free art as sculpture, which the ancients say that handicraft is not, but that the former is, the use of the square and compasses artistically. Brother G.W. Speth advocated with a little hesitancy that as the traveling masons moved about, they adopted the term free to indicate that they were outside or free from any guild but that established under their own constitution. It does not necessarily follow, however, that the term free had everywhere the same import. Scotland has many important documents. The Chevalier Ramsay, in his Paris oration of 1737, states that James, Lord Steward of Scotland, in 1286 held a lodge at Kilwinning and initiated the Earls of Gloucester and Ulster into Freemasonry. What authority there is for this statement no one now knows, but Tytler in his History of Scotland shows that these two earls were present at a meeting of the adherents of Robert Bruce at Turnberry Castle, which is about 30 miles west of Kilwinning Abbey, and were concerting plans for the vindication of his claims to the Scottish throne. The rebuilding of Melrose Abbey in Scotland was begun in 1326 under King Robert the Bruce, who seems to have been a protector of the Templars. There is a legend in regard to a window which is said to have been wrought by an apprentice who was slain by his master out of jealousy, and the same myth applies to similar work in other countries. The structure is full of recondite symbolism both within and without. The chapel is interpreted to represent the human body in all its parts. In symbols there is a pelican feeding its young and the phoenix rising from its ashes. It contains a later inscription on the lintel of the turret stairs as follows, and there are others of like import. So goes the compass round about, truth and loyalty do without doubt. Behold to the end, quoth John Morrow. A second on the west wall of the south transept is a shield inscribed to the next John Moray, or Murray, who was son of Patrick, bearing 2 pairs of compasses laid across each other between 3 fleurs-de-lis, though his own arms were 3 mullets in chief and a fleur-de-lis in base. The older of the 2 inscriptions refers to a John Moray, who died 1476, a mason but also keeper of Newark Castle in 1467, and whose son Patrick had the same status until 1490. The epitaph of the second of the name is thus read: John Morrow, sometime called was I, and born in Paris certainly, and had in keeping all mason work of St Andrew's the High Kirk, of Glasgow, Melrose and Paisley, of Nithsdale and of Galloway. Pray to God and Mary both, and sweet St John to keep this holy kirk from scathe. This John Moray had grants of lands from James IV in 1490 and 1497, was Sheriff of Selkirk 1501, and assassinated on his way to the Sheriff's Court in 1510. In the reign of Edward III, 1327 to 1377, we are told by Anderson that lodges were many and frequent, and that great men were masons, the king patronizing the arts and sciences. He says that it is implicitly implied in an old record that in the glorious reign of King Edward III, when lodges were many and frequent, the Grand Master with his wardens at the head of Grand Lodge, with consent of the lords of the realm, then generally Freemasons, ordained that for the future, at the making or admission of a brother, the constitutions shall be read, and the charges hereunto annexed. Such specific statement is not at present known, and is doubtless a paraphrase of the existing manuscripts. The king founded the Abbey of Eastminster, and others built many stately mansions and about 30 pious houses in spite of all the expensive wars of this reign. The south transept of Gloucester Cathedral was begun about the year 1330 and is traditionally said to be by John Goure, who built Camden Church and Gloucester Tower. He is believed to be represented in a monument, of which an engraving appears in Ars Quatuor Coronatorum, Volume 2. It is in form of a mason square, and the builder is represented as if supporting it. His arm is in the position of hailing his fellows. Below the man's effigy is a budget of tools. Until a recent restoration of the ancient church of the Dominicans in Limerick, there was, on the gable end, the half-length figure of a person in monkish dress. The right hand was clutching the heart, and the left arm, kept close to the side, was raised with the palm outward, index and second finger raised. In 1330, Thomas of Canterbury, a master mason, began work at St Stephen's Chapel, Westminster. The Abbey Gate of Bury St Edmunds contains the double triangles and is of this period. On the carved bosses of a Gothic church at Linlithgow are these emblems. 1. A double circle within which is a book upon which are square and compasses. 2. A double square within which are 2 circles, and in these a double lozenge in the center of which is the letter G. The brass of John de Bereford at Allhallows, Mayor 1356 to 1357 of Oxford, contains a shield on which are square and compasses. At Dryburgh Abbey there is a tomb, late this century, on which is a cross-hilted sword surrounded by a wreath of ivy, and on each side of the sword the square and compasses. This, and others of like nature, might imply the initiation of a person of knightly rank. The condemnation of the 1326 Council of Avignon would seem to have had its influence in England, for upon the Black Death of 1348, when near half the population died, an ordinance of 1350, confirmed by statute law in 1360, forbade all alliances, covines, congregations, chapters, ordinances and oaths amongst masons, carpenters and artisans, and this statute was endorsed by others of a like nature in 1368, 1378, 1414 and 1423. These laws are, however, rather directed against journeymen, apprentices and labourers, and in any case, from their repetition at long intervals, had little effect upon the Masonic assemblies. A much more important bearing upon the Masonic organization is a record of 1356. At this period there was a dispute in existence between the layer masons or setters and the mason squarers. 6 members of each class appeared before the mayor, sheriff and alderman of the City of London to have their organization defined in order that the disputes which had arisen between them might be adjusted. because that their trades had not been regulated by the folks of their trade in such form as other trades are. That is, they had not yet been so regulated in the city of London. Amongst these representatives of the Mason squarers was Henry Yeverley, the Freemasons as opposed to the layer Masons, who were perhaps derived from the ancient body of the kingdom, who would suffer in status by French importations and would prefer elsewhere the Saxon constitution. The mayor, after consultation with these two sections, drew up a code of 10 rules which appears in full in Gould's History of Freemasonry, and which virtually allowed the two bodies identical privileges and rules mutually with a 7 years apprenticeship. In either case, a master, taking any work in gross, was to bring 6 or 4 sworn men of the ancients of his trade to prove his ability and to act as his sureties, and they were to be ruled by sworn overseers. 12 masters were sworn, which virtually united both bodies and made a uniform rule for both, thus establishing the London Company of Masons. Such a union of the Christian Masonry of York and the Semitic Masonry of the Normans, coupled with the grant of royal charters to the masters, might lead to the recognition of the rites of the Herodim Rosy Cross as the unification of the two, which it actually is. It is quite probable that this judicious action of the mayor saved London a repetition of the disturbances which occurred in France amongst the sects of the Compagnonnage. In the middle of the 14th century, Ranulph Higden had compiled his Polychronicon in the Benedictine monastery of St. Werburgh, Chester, which is here noted as it constituted the authority for all the Masonic charges as to Jabal, Jubal, Tubal and Naama. Nimrod and his cousin Asher, the two pillars of Enoch, the origin of geometry, etc., and which introduced into the Saxon charge by the author of the Cook manuscript, whoever that may have been, became the basis of all the later charges which have come down to us. It is quite probable that the old 17th century lodge, of which Randall Holmes was a member, dates from the earliest period of Norman architecture in Chester, if not beyond. Its prior antiquity is proved by the fact that it had in the 17th century ceased to have any practical object in relation to architecture. The ancient Scotch lodges in most cases advanced such claims. This era was the beginning of the rectilinear or perpendicular style of architecture which continued in vogue down to 1550. From 1349 works were in progress at Windsor, and John de Spoulet, master stonecutter, to whom Anderson has given the title of Master of the Giblim, though in Ashmole's Order of the Garter the term used is stonecutter, had power given him to impress masons. He rebuilt St. George's Chapel, where the king instituted the Order of the Garter in 1350. In 1356, William of Wykeham, who was made Bishop of Winchester in 1367, was appointed surveyor, and in 1359 chief warden and surveyor of various castles, and employed 400 Freemasons at Windsor. In 1360 the king impressed 360 Masons at his own wages, and attempts were made to punish those who left work, and this is the year in which the statute law was passed against all alliances, covines and oaths, so that the one may have influenced the other. About this year, William Eddington, Bishop of Winchester, erected a very beautiful church at Eddington. In 1362, writs were issued for the king's works to impress 302 masons and delvers of stone, and the counties of York, Devon and Salop were to furnish 60 men each. These arbitrary proceedings of the king have an explanatory bearing upon both the statute laws and the Masonic charges. In 1365, Henry Yeverley, already referred to as a mason cutter, was director of the work of St. Stephen's Chapel, now the House of Parliament, and according to Anderson is called at first in the old records the King's Freemason. He built for the king the London Charter House, King's Hall in Cambridge, and Queensborough Castle. In 1370, William de Winsford Cementarius was sent beyond sea to retain divers masons for the service of the king. In 1375, Robert of Barnum, at the head of 250 Freemasons, completed St. George's Great Hall, and Simon Langham, Abbot of Westminster, repaired the body of that cathedral. In Prior Fossor's time, 1341 to 1374, the great west window of Durham Cathedral was placed, and the altar screen finished in 1380, to which Lord Neville of Raby contributed 600 marks. Green, in his History of the English People, has some remarks on the English guilds which we may run over here. He says that Frank Pledge and the Frith Guild sprang out of kinship and were recognized both by Alfred and Athelstan. The Merchant Guild of London sprang out of various guilds in the city which were united into one by Athelstan. But this led to a craft guild struggle, for their wardens had the inspection of all work done, all tools necessary for the good of their several trades. Apart from the Masons, who had their own records not mentioned by Green, the first to secure royal sanction was the Weavers, who had their charter from Henry I, though the contest went on during the reign of John, for the control of trade in the 11th century had begun to pass from the Merchant Guild to those of the craft. It may also be added that the Masons had begun to pass from monastic control and were becoming secularized. A constant struggle was taking place between the prud'hommes, or wise, and the commune. Those craftsmen who were unenfranchised united in secret frith guilds and mobs arose, but the open contest did not begin until 1261, when the craftsmen invaded the town moat, set aside the aldermen, and chose Thomas Fitz-Thomas for their mayor. The contest continued until the time of Edward III, who himself joined the Guild of Armourers. Charters had now been granted to every trade, and their ordinances duly enrolled in the mayor's court, and distinctive liveries assumed. Green adds that the wealthier citizens, now finding their power broken, sought to regain their old influence by enrolling themselves as members of the trade guilds. With the exception of the Masons' Guild at York, which was continuously employed on the Minster and other churches in York, and as these sent guilds to other distant parts which ceased to exist when their work was done, it is impossible to trace old guilds in permanency. When they had completed their labors, they would report to York, and as workmen were required elsewhere, a guild with the proper complement of apprentices, fellows, and past masters would be sent there. In some cases, in small towns, a remnant would remain in permanence, and it is to such as these that we owe a special charge distinct from that of the General Assembly. In 1377, the guilds of London were reconstituted and became known as livery companies from their special livery or dress. In place of guild, we now have crafts and mysteries, and for aldermen, the masters or wardens. The Masons had sent 4 members and the Freemasons 2 members to the municipal council, but an old list shows that this distinction had been done away with, and an erasure is made to credit the delegates as Masons. The oath of the wardens is preserved. They swore well and truly to oversee the craft of masonry, to observe its rules, and to bring all defaulters before the chamberlain of the city, to spare no man for favor, nor grieve any man for hate, to commit neither extortion nor wrong, nor in anything to be against the peace of the king or city. The oath concludes, as in the French formula before mentioned, "So help you God and all Sintis." The title of the London Company of Masons at this time was the Craft and Fellowship of Masons. The court rolls of the Manor of Long Bennington, County of Lincoln, the Lord being Thomas of Woodstock, the youngest son of Edward III, has John Plaister and John Freemason in this year. The charters of city companies of Masons was clearly a legalized usurpation of the Saxon right of assembly, and modelled upon the older fraternities of France. Where such city companies were chartered, the result might be the withdrawal of the masters into the livery, leading to the continuation of the assembly by journeymen and amateurs. To put the question in other words, some assemblies may have become livery companies, whilst York and other northern towns continued the ancient rite of Masonic assembly. And in regard to this, the views of Brother Speth that the Masonic assembly and the charges belonging thereto is a claim that they were free from the guilds is worthy of close consideration. Brother Gould has mentioned several instances where journeymen attempted to establish guilds for their own enjoyment and protection, but were speedily suppressed by the masters. In 1387, 3 cordwainers had been promised a papal brief for this purpose, but only obtained the privilege of the London prison of Newgate. A similar attempt of the journeyman saddlers was suppressed in 1396. The same befell the journeyman tailors in 1415. Also the Journeyman Guild of St. George at Coventry in 1427. Unfortunately, all the documents of the London Company of Masons prior to 1620 have been lost, or we should have had valuable information as to the working of that guild. Brother Edward Conder has shown that the company at the earliest period of its records had a speculative lodge meeting at its hall, which was not confined to Masons by profession, and that a master's grade, such as is spoken of in the Regius and Cook manuscripts, was the appanage of the fellowship, by which accepted or non-operatives became qualified for the rank of liverymen and assistants who composed the governing council, and thus the Esoteric or Symbolic branch was allied with the Exoteric one on the council. We will now return in a few notes to works in progress at this period. In the reign of Richard II, 1377 to 1399, about 15 pious houses were built. Between 1380 and 1386, the building of the new college in Oxford was accomplished by William of Wykeham. The wardens and fellows, 14th April 1386, made solemn entrance, marching in procession with the cross borne before them and chanting litanies. Between 1387 and 1393, the same architect founded Winchester College. It contains the arms of the architect, which have a peculiarity worthy of notice. They are two chevronels or carpenter's couples between three roses, motto, "Manners maketh man." It is probably but a coincidence that if we reverse a Master Mason's apron, it is a copy of the arms of Wykeham, whilst the motto, as previously noted, is found in the Regius manuscript. And in a book on etiquette styled Urbanitatis, of which it is possible he may have been author, his Master Mason was William de Winsford, mentioned here in 1370, and his portrait as William Winfor Lathomas appears in stained glass with that of the Master Carpenter and Dominus Simon Membury, supervisor or clerk of the works. In the old Masonic charges, there is a law that no fellow shall go into the town at night without a fellow to bear him company as witness of his good conduct. And Brother F. Compton Price, who has executed the beautiful facsimiles of Masonic manuscripts, points out that Wykeham had the same law for the monks and canons, who were prohibited from going abroad without leave of the prior and without a companion. From 1389 to 1391, the celebrated poet Geoffrey Chaucer was clerk of the works over the King's Masons, and it is possible that our old charges may have had some influence upon his poetical works. Romsey Abbey has a pillar in the south aisle, upon the capital of which is sculptured certain figures supposed to represent the dedicators of the church. It has a trowel and a large square said to contain the words "Roet me fecit." Between the years 1389 and 1391, two very beautiful churches were erected, one at the village of Shotsbrook in Berkshire, and the other at Winnington in Beds, but the perpendicular style had not reached these places. St. Michael's Church in Coventry was completed in 1395, St. Nicholas in Lynn 1400, the Collegiate Church in Manchester was in progress, and it has been supposed the builders met at the adjacent Seven Stars, a very ancient hostelry. Works were in constant progress at York from 1349 to 99 and even down to 1520. In the year 1352, the chapter of the Minster issued regulations for the Masons employed, which are interesting in themselves and indicate to us various particulars which show how carefully old Masonic customs have been handed down to us. It would be an error to suppose that such lodges as are described herein were the York Assembly. That body was an annual assembly drawn from all the Masons within a wide circle. Such lodges might possibly receive apprentices. The document from which we quote the following particulars is part of the Fabric Rolls printed by the Surtees Society, 1352. The first and second Masons, who are masters of the same, and the carpenters, took an oath to carry out these regulations. After work between May and August, breakfast was to last half an hour, and then the aforesaid masters, or one of them, shall knock upon the door of the lodge, and forthwith all shall go to their work. After dinner they shall sleep within their lodge, and when the vicars have come from the canon's dinner table, the Master Mason, or his substitute, shall cause them to rise and come to their work. Then they were to work from the first bell for vespers, and then drink within the lodge until the third bell of St. Mary's Abbey, called Le Longe Bell. The aforesaid two Master Masons and carpenters of the fabric shall be present at each drinking time, and these shall notify to the keeper of the fabric and to the controller thereof all failures and absences. In 1370, the Dean and Chapter issued another code of regulations under which none were allowed to go away above a mile, under penalty of a fine. A new workman was to be tested for a week, and if he is found inconniscent of his work, be received by the common assent of the master, and the keeper of the work and of the master mason shall swear upon the book that he shall truly and busily at his power, without any manner of guile, faintness, or deceit, hold and keep holy all the points of this foresaid ordinance in all things that him touches or may touch from the time that he be received. In this same year, Master Robert de Patrington and 12 masons appeared and received articles to this tenor. Lords, if it be your wills, we grant for to stand at our works truly and at our power. In the following year, we find that this master had under him 35 masons and apprentices, 18 labourers, and the church found them livery of tunics, aprons, gloves, and clogs. In 1389, the masters and wardens of guilds were ordered by the crown to make a return of their laws, oaths, feasts, meetings, and if they possessed charters to produce them, and the existence of both social and craft guilds is admitted by issue of separate writs. A body such as the London Fellowship of Masons, says Brother R.F. Gould, would not be affected by such writs, for it had the governance of the London craft. And Anderson expresses an opinion in 1723 that its members had first been received according to well-known Masonic forms. Masons in many parts who had no charters would no doubt be affected by the writs of 1389. And it is very probable that the order may have led to the compilation of a series of constitutional charges which were again and again recopied and handed down to us in later manuscripts. But it is clear that such scribes did not hesitate at any time to introduce supposed improvements of their own. Whether or not such a recompilation originated thus, the laws of the country show that assemblies continued to be held down to the 15th century, and Masonic documents prove their later continuance. And the variations in the manuscripts lead us to believe that if there were Masons who preferred a Norman French charge, there were others who preferred their ancient Saxon privilege of a right of assembly to obligate fellows and past masters. We will give particulars of 2 such documents shortly, both of which embrace legends of this date. We will now say a little upon the symbolism of the time, both English and foreign. Dr. Inman of Liverpool has the following. The ancient parish church of Bebbington, Cheshire, has not only the solar wheel, the spikes of which terminate in the phallic triad, as one of the adornments of the reredos, but abounds with deltas, acorns, Maltese crosses, enfolding triangles, and virgins who, like the ancient Isis, are crowned with the inverted crescent, the chaplet being still further adorned with the 7 planets. A very interesting series of marks cut between 1120 and 1534 has been collected by Brother Rylands. At Great Waltham there are some well-carved panel heads of open seats, the tops of which in triplicated form contain the 5-pointed star, with a ball in the centre. The pavement of Westminster Abbey contains the double triangle, each angle containing a small one, whilst 3 triangles separated appear in the centre. During the 18th century, certain leaden medals designated morali were disinterred at Dover and believed to be travelling tokens from one monastery to another, ensuring welcome. Some bore a 5-pointed star, others had a dot at each angle, and the letter G in the centre. Masons, as a necessity, were travellers and could not carry work to their shop. The Reverend Brother A.F. Woodford, whose ability as a Masonic authority is unquestioned, has several times stated in print that there was found in the Minster Yard in York an ancient token or seal, undoubtedly of the 14th century, which had upon it words only known to Masons and Hieramites. By a statute of Henry VI, 1406, the liverymen of guilds were permitted to wear girdles of silk embroidered with silver and gold. The date to the will of John Cadaby is indecipherable, but earlier than 1451, as one of the persons mentioned in it died in that year. Brother G.F. Fort, in his treatise on builders' marks, quotes Matthew of Arras and Peter Ala, whose images in the Cathedral of Prague of the end of the 14th century, where in the former case his mark on a keystone set in a semicircle depending from a broad band of blue, and Peter Ala's is a perfect square. A guild mason would say that the mark of Matthew of Arras proves him to have belonged to an arch guild, though blue is a craft colour. The inventory of the will here, named of John Cadaby of Beverley Mason, has mention of several zonas which, though literally girdles, may be interpreted aprons. 1 silk zona, green and red, silver mounted, weight 17 ounces, 32 shillings and 8 pence. 1 silk zona, silver mounted with leaves and ivy, weighs 7 1/4 ounces, 40 shillings and 8 pence. 1 silk zona, silver mounted with roses, weighs 9 3/4 ounces, 16 shillings and 3 pence. 1 damaged silk zona, silver mounted with letters B and I in the middle, weight 1 zona of mixture, silvered, ornamented with stars, 3 shillings. 1 zona of black and green silk, weight 3 ounces, 3 shillings. The girdle, then an article of clothing in general use, was appropriate to a master. The foreign churches of the 14th century are equally suggestive in symbolism common to Masonry. The dome of Würzburg in front of the Chamber of the Dead has 2 columns, which are supposed to date from 1040 but may be later. On one is the letters I Ak Hyon and Bu Z. There is an old church in Hanover which was building from 1284 to 1350, and which contains the circle, double triangles and pentagon. In this church is also a statue of St. George with the red cross and one of St. James the Pilgrim. At one time it possessed a charger with the Baptist's head. An inscription says, "The fire was a sore thorn to Stoics and Hebrews," which a chronicle of 1695 refers to the fact of the burning of the Templars, 1310 to 1313, a remark which would seem to imply a belief that these knights were guilty of monotheistic heresy. Hargrave Jennings says that in old representations of the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, the sun and moon with other emblems are placed respectively on the 2 porches. The Church of Doberan has many double triangles placed in a significant manner. 3 vine leaves united by a cord and symbolic ciphers. There is also a painting in the same church in which the apostles are represented in Masonic attitudes. Fort asserts that in one of the churches of Florence are life-size figures in Masonic attitudes. Many paintings of the Old Masters are said to exhibit similar characteristics. The Church of Santa Croce, Florence, over the main portal, has a figure of Christ holding in the hand a perfect square. He it was who told Peter that, "Upon this stone Petra I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." Clavel states that the figure of Christ in the Church of Saint Denis has the hand placed in a position well known to Freemasons. At the beginning of this chapter, we gave other information hereon. The Abbey Church of St. Owen in Rouen, begun in 1318 and completed by Alexander Berneval, who died in 1440 and was buried in the church, has a legend in regard to a very fine rose window which is identical with that of Melrose. The 5-pointed star appears in the stone tracery, and Murray says that there is a tradition that it was made by an apprentice whom Berneval, the master mason, slew out of jealousy, because he had surpassed himself. Other edifices at Rouen contain the Pentagon. This general identity of symbolism in various countries tends to prove a secret understanding amongst all Masons as to its meaning, and a similar initiation of the builders everywhere, which as they traveled about, ensured a brotherly welcome. Victor Hugo, in his novel of Notre Dame, says that there is an intimate connection between architecture and the Hermetic philosophy. He further alleges an alchemical symbolism in the sculpture attributed to Bishop William of Paris in the Great Portal. He also instances the virgins with their lamps turned down and those turned up. The opening of the Book of Philosophy, some naked figures at the foot of Mary, one with wings on the heels, Mercury, the Sower, Job, the philosopher's stone tortured to become perfect, a dragon with its tail in a bath from which rises smoke and a king's head, demons and dragon's head, and Abraham offering his son Isaac. In the reign of Henry IV, 1399 to 1413, 6 pious houses were built. The Londoners erected their guild hall, and the king founded Battle Abbey in Shrewsbury, and afterwards that of Fotheringay. In 1399, Hugh de Hedon had employed at York 28 masons, but fuller information will be found in the fabric rolls. In the reign of Henry V, 1413 to 1422, 8 pious houses were built, and the king rebuilt the palace and the Abbey of Sheen under the direction of Henry Chicheley, Archbishop of Canterbury. At York, our dread Lord the King had, in 1416, given them William de Colchester from Westminster Abbey. The appointment must have been an unpopular one, for in the 3rd year of his mastership, certain stonecutters assaulted and did grievously injure him and his assistant. The work continued here down to 1520. Catterick Bridge was constructed in 1413, and the three masons were to have a gown according to their degree, but this will mean employment rank. Catterick Church was begun in 1421, and the masons were to have a luge of tree with 4 rooms of sills and of 2 hen forks. The reign of Henry VI lasted from 1422 to 61, and he was an infant upon his succession. It is tolerably certain that in his reign the Masons were dabblers in the hermetic sciences. During the time of Henry IV, alchemy was made felony by an Act of 1404, which continued in force during the reign of Henry V. Henry VI took the art under his protection and obtained the consent of Parliament, empowering 3 Lancashire gentlemen, lovers of truth and haters of deception, to practice the art. An Act of Parliament was passed in 1425, alleging that by the yearly congregations and confederacies of the Masons in their general chapters assembled, the good effect of the statutes of labourers was violated and prohibited all such meetings. No effect was given to this act, and it remained a dead letter on the statute book until the reign of Queen Elizabeth, when it passed into oblivion, being annulled by other acts. In 1424, Prior Wessington repaired the tower of Durham Cathedral and spent £2,454 of the money of the time. In 1426, the Masons, erecting Walberswick Steeple, were to be provided with a house to work in, to eat and drink, and to lie in, and to make meat in, to be built near the place of working. In 1427, William of Warmington began the rebuilding of the western tower of Croyland Abbey and the vaulting with stone of the north aisle. His memorial stone, which has been engraved in Ars Quatua, represents him as holding a square in his right hand and a pair of compasses in his left. There are other Masonic symbols carved here, for which consult the reference under the date 1113. There was a lodge of Masons attached to the Priory of Canterbury at this time, as the Register of William Malash in 1429 mentions Thomas Stapleton, the master, John Morris, the custos or warden, both of whom rank as esquires, and 16 Masons. All received their livery or clothing. Chicheley also had livery, and these extracts prove that Christ Church Convent had a considerable body of Masons working at the building. St. Mary's Church, Bury, was begun 1424. In the contract with Horwood for building the nave of Fotheringay Church in 1434, it is enacted that if the 2 said letters, or any of them, be not profitable nor sufficient workmen for the Lord's avail, then by oversight of master masons of the county they shall be denied. If Horwood did not fulfill his engagements, he shall yield his body to prison at my Lord's will, Duke of York, and all his movable goods and heritages be at my said Lord's disposition and ordinance. In 1439, the Abbot of St. Edmundsbury contracts with John Wood for the restoration of the Great Bell Tower in all manner of things that long to Freemasonry, and to have board for himself as a gentleman and his servant as a yeoman, and thereby 2 robes, one for himself after a gentleman's livery. Southwell Church was begun 1440. In 1436, an act was passed which required the masters, wardens, people of the guilds, fraternities, and other companies incorporate to produce their letters patent to the justices and others where such guilds and fraternities be for their approval. This act is directed against such bodies making their own laws, and it mentions the chief master as distinct from the masons under him. It is a very valid supposition that it was this circumstance which led to the production of the Masonic Constitution for the sanction of the king, as several old copies known last century assert that it was. It has been suggested that the king's master mason of our large cities might be the head of the Masonic assemblies to whom the rest were responsible. There is a catechism purporting to be the examination of a Freemason by Henry VI, which admits occult studies. It was given to the world last century under the name of the antiquaries Leland and John Locke. And though possibly a forgery, in its present shape may have been the actual catechism of some lodge given to these studies, there is, however, ancient and genuine testimony to the practice of alchemy by the Masons. We instanced in our chapter 6 on the Hermetic schools the nature of the symbolism of Jacques Coeur 1450 and that of Basil Valentine. Whatever uncertainty there may be about this, there is none in the fact that Thomas Norton classes the Freemasons by name as giving themselves to alchemical studies. One Richard Carter in this year, 1476, had granted him a license to practice alchemy. During this reign, Waynflete, Bishop of Winchester, and Archbishop Chicheley superintended the erection of various buildings in Oxford, Cambridge, and others built 12 pious houses. Fuller says of King's College in Cambridge, founded by Henry VI in 1441, that it is one of the rarest fabrics in Christendom. Churches begun: St. Mary's Redcliffe, 1440, Tattershall, 1455. In Scotland, William St. Clair built Roslin Chapel in 1445, and Mr. James Ferguson considers that the builders were from North Spain. Within it is a very beautiful pillar called the Prentice's Pillar, to which a legend is attached which says that whilst the master went to Rome for instruction, an apprentice completed the work in his absence, and that out of envy at seeing the beauty of the workmanship he slew the apprentice by a blow on the forehead. 3 heads are shown in the chapel as representing those of the master, the apprentice, and the widowed mother, but it has been suggested that they may equally represent Joseph, Jesus, and Mary in their application to the rites of Harodim Rosy Cross. A similar apprentice legend is attached to Cologne, Strasbourg, Rouen, Melrose, Lincoln, and to other places. And though it has a distinct esoteric reference easily understood by all Masons, may possibly be carried forward to an Asiatic superstition that a building intended to endure must be cemented by the sacrifice of life. Brother Speth is of opinion that in addition to a foundation sacrifice previously mentioned, there was a completion sacrifice made at the crowning of the edifice, and that it was a custom obtaining amongst the Teutonic and other races, of which he gives many examples. 2 documents, actually copied at this period, deserve ample reference here. One is the Cook manuscript, written about 1450, and of the other there are several duplicates, the Watson manuscript, which we shall take as our reference, the duplicates being the Head manuscript, dated 1675. Another is quoted by Dr. Plott in 1686, and Dr. James Anderson, between 1723 and 38, had seen a copy. Brother Dr. W. Begerman has investigated the Cook manuscript and considers that it is copied from one about the year 1410, whilst the second part, or Book of Charges, is much earlier by at least a century, the preface being compiled in a West Midland county. Upon the Watson manuscript, a valuable commentary by Brother C.C. Howard of Picton has been printed with a facsimile, and he shows very forcibly that it is a more complete and unabridged version than the preface to the Cook manuscript. But this also has been taken from a copy at least 3 removes from the original compilation, which served both for the Cook and the Watson manuscripts, which again might be amplified copies of still older manuscripts. It is probable that modifications may have been made to adapt it for presentation to Henry VI and the Lords of his Honourable Council about the year 1442, and it may have been slightly modified in the next reign when again copied, as little changes are made in all copies, no 2 being verbally alike. It will be convenient to place the 2 copies side by side and to distinguish where the variations occur, to suit them to 2 different Masonic schools. These manuscripts begin with a description of the 7 liberal arts and sciences upon which all crafts in the world were founded, and especially geometry, which is the basis of all other arts, for there is no handicraft, but it is wrought by geometry. The author's legendary origin of the craft begins with Adam. Before Noah's flood, there was a man called Lamech, who had 2 wives, one hight Ada and another Zillah. By the first wife, that hight Ada, he begat 2 sons, that hight Jabal and the other hight Jubal. Jabal was Cain's master mason and governor of all his works. When he made the city of Enoch, that was the first city. Jubal was the founder of music. Lamech begat upon his other wife, that hight Zillah, Tubal-Cain, and his daughter Nama. This son Tubal-Cain was the founder of smith's craft. Nama was the founder of weaver's craft. Being forewarned of the deluge, they wrote the sciences upon 2 manner of stones, marble and latrese, one of which would not burn nor the other sink. A great clerk that was called Putugoras found that one, and Hermes the philosopher found the other. Nimrod began to build the Tower of Babel, and taught the workmen craft of measures, and had 40,000 masons whom he loved and cherished well. Nimrod sent to his cousin Assur 300 of masons, and gave them a charge. Abraham, a wise man and a great clerk, taught geometry to the Egyptians, and had a worthy clerk called Euclid as his pupil. A relation, varied in terms from the more ancient form, is given as to Euclid's governance. The author then tells us that the children of Israel learned masonry when they were in Egypt, that King David loved well masons, and he gave them charges right nigh as they be now. And Solomon confirmed the charges that David his father had given to masons. Thence the worthy science passed into France, where was a worthy king called Charles II. He was a mason before he was a king, and gave them charges. Up to this point, the two manuscripts are in perfect agreement, allowing for copyists' errors, but they now diverge in a remarkable manner, and we give a summary side by side, the Watson manuscript complete in itself, the Cook having an older part attached. Watson manuscript. In the Watson manuscript, the account given of a charge by St. Alban is very full. It gives Athelstan for authority that Amphibel came out of France and converted St. Alban to Christendom. He was steward of the king and built the walls of Verulam, cherished masons and made them good pay, and gave charges as Amphibel had brought them out of France. Edwin, son of Athelstan, purchased from his father the right of assembly and correction within themselves, and held an assembly at York. The style of charges differ from the Cook manuscript, and yet allusions are made in these legends to books of charges, as if existing, which embrace Nimrod, Solomon, Euclid, St. Alban, Athelstan. A general series of charges has been collected out of these, which do not differ so much in substance from the Saxon charge, as they are differently certain of the points, and such as duty to king and church and employers are charges to masons in general. There is also no distinction between master's articles and fellows' points, but this might be the work of a later scribe. Stewards of the lodge, chamber or hall are mentioned as in the Regius manuscript. The Cook manuscript may have an imperfection, as the duties appear but not the word steward, to which evidently the duties are intended to apply. Cook manuscript. In the Cook manuscript, the charge and account of St. Alban is much abridged. It says, "Soon after that came St. Adabel into England and converted St. Alban to Christianity, who gave them charges. And after that there was a worthy king in England that was called Athelstan, and his youngest son loved well the science of geometry, wherefore he drew him to counsel, and learned the practice of that science to his speculative. For of speculative he was a master, and he loved well masonry and masons." It is an abridgment of the Watson manuscript, and goes on to say that this unnamed son purchased a free patent of the king that they should make assembly when they saw a reasonable time. This omission of the son's name partially avoids a difficulty, as Athelstan had no son, but he had a younger brother, Edwin, who went to sea in a leaky boat and was drowned arranged. In later times, attempts were made to fix his death upon King Athelstan. The manuscript concludes with the remark that, as to the manner of assembly, as it is written and taught in the book of our charges, wherefore I leave it at this time. The author attaches an actual book of charges, which is admittedly of an older date than the preface of the manuscript to the point at which it leaves off. The closing lines, which precede the charges of the Watson manuscript, are as follows. These charges have been seen and perused by our late sovereign Lord King Henry VI and the Lords of the Honourable Council, and they have allowed them well, and said they were right, good and reasonable to be holden. And these charges have been drawn and gathered out of diverse ancient books, both of the old law and new law, as they were confirmed and made in Egypt by the king, and the great clerk Euclidus, and at the making of Solomon's temple by King David and Salom his son, and in England by St. Alban, who was the king's steward, that was at that time, and afterwards by King Ethelstone, that was king of England, and his son Edwin, that was king after his father, as it is rehearsed in many and diverse histories and stories and chapters. To some extent, the false chronology of these manuscripts might be reconciled if we substitute Hermes for Euclid and Chaldeans for Abraham, but this latter would only be correct at a certain period of Egyptian history when the shepherd kings were in power, and scarcely historically accurate. The chronology has been disarranged apparently by adding the Euclid charge in a document to which it does not belong. The introduction into the Albanus legend of Amphibulus with charges from France betrays the work of an Anglo-Norman, for Britain supplied France with artisans at that remote period. The whole basis of the Watson manuscript and the first part of the Cook manuscript point to a French original, and the laws might be considered more applicable as given in the Watson manuscript to a chartered company which had the supervision of lodges of the craft. We consider, as we have before stated, that the Watson manuscript may represent the union of two sects and the amalgamation of their constitutional charges. Our learned brother, the late W.H. Upton, past Grand Master of Washington, USA, thinks that Hermes may have been first described as Lucis Pater, and that Euclid may have been described as pupil of Hermes, until someone destroyed the context by interpolating Abraham. In reference to the Alban legend, he supposes that Amphibulus may be a later gloss, and that the Saxon text might be accommodated thus. The good rule of Masonry was destroyed until the time of Knight Athelstan, a worthy son of King Edward, and he brought the land into good rest and peace, and he, Athelstan, loved Masons more than his father. The Edwin legend thus arising by substitution of the short Edward of the father, he would restore the Saxon thus. In the time of the young man during Athelstan's day, a worthy son of King Edward there was, and the son brought, and he loved the craft more than his father Edward. Other emendations will be found noticed in the appendix with which we close this book. Architecture is said to have been much neglected during the 17 years of the Wars of the Roses, but in the reign of Edward IV, 1461 to 83, the walls of London were rebuilt and 7 pious houses erected. Wakefield Church, Yorkshire, was begun in 1470. St. Stephen's, Bristol, same year. Blythborough Church, Suffolk, was completed in 1472. St. Lawrence, Norwich, in the same year. Swaffham, Norfolk, 1474. St. Mary's, Oxford, and St. Mary's, Cambridge, in 1478. Long Melford, Suffolk, 1481. Heswell Church Tower, Cheshire, was in course of erection, and its mason's marks were printed in 1894 by Brother Rylands. The King in 1475 expresses general disapprobation against the giving of liveries, signs, tokens, retainers of indenture, promises, oaths, and writings. And this is about the date when the original of the Watson manuscript was made. John Islip, Abbot of Westminster, finished the repair of the abbey in 1483. In 1472, the whole craft and fellowship of Masons had coat armor granted, sable, a chevron argent engrailed between 3 castles garnished with doors and windows of the field, on the chevron a compass sable, crest, a castle triple-towered as in the arms. The oldest motto, God is our guide, which later gave place to this, in the Lord is all our trust. With slight differences, the lodges generally adopted these arms. Brother Conder informs us that the company at one time possessed the constitutions of the fellowship, presented to them in the mayoralty of John Brown in 1481. These were the laws of their own body as a company, but are now lost. Germany. It is known that the Emperor Rudolf I, even in the year 1275, authorized an order of Masons, whilst Pope Nicholas III, in the year 1278, granted to the Brotherhood of Stonemasons at Strasbourg a letter of indulgence which was renewed by all his successors down to Benedict XII in 1340. The oldest order of German Masons arises in 1397. Next follow the so-called Vienna Witnesses of 1412, 1434, 1435. Then the Strasbourg Order of Lodges in 1464, that of Torgau 1462, and finally 16 different orders on to 1500, and the following centuries. For Spiers, Regensburg, Saxony, Altenburg, Straßburg, Esoteric and Ungarn. Geschichte der Freimaurerei in Österreich und Ungarn. Ludwig Abafe, Budapest, 1890-91. The German Statutes of Ratisbon, 1459, and of Strasbourg, 1464, confirmed by the Emperor Maximilian I on the 1st of May, 1498, are but a more ornate version of those of England. They were to be kept secret by the Master upon his oath, and were his authority, as he had charge of the contribution book, and they were to be read yearly to the fellows in the lodge. The Brotherhood Book of 1563 mentions 22 towns where copies were kept. This book contains the following: Every apprentice, when he has served his time and is declared free, shall promise the craft on his troth and honour, in lieu of oath under pain of losing his right to practice masonry, that he will disclose or communicate the mason's greeting and grip to no one except to him to whom he may justly communicate it, and also that he will write nothing whatever. And every master having aforesaid apprentices shall earnestly enjoin and invite each one, when he has thus completed the above written 5 years, to become a brother by the oath which such one has taken to the craft and is offered to each. Vicentius in the Mirror of the World, printed by Caxton in 1480, contains short descriptions of the 7 liberal arts and sciences, similar to the description in the Masonic charges, but adding to each an explanatory woodcut. A book was published by Veldener in Holland in 1486, which is said to contain symbolism of craft and Egyptian initiation. The book of Ludwig Abafi says of Bohemia and Hungary that they had other mystic brotherhoods: Die Bruder von Reif und Hammer, Brothers of the Circle and Hammer, Die Hackbruder Schaft, Brotherhood of the Hatchet, Die Freund vom Kreuz, Friends of the Cross, which spread to Netherlands and were still holding meetings in 1785 in Wallachia, Transylvania and other places. The Torgau Ordinances of 1462 indicate clearly the German qualification for granting a mark, enacting, in Article 94, that no fellow shall qualify if he has not served his time or has bought his mark and not honestly earned it. By Article 25, at his freedom, he demanded a mark from his workmaster and had to make a payment for the service of God. Article 12 enacts that if anyone communed with a harlot, he should retire from the lodge, so far as one may cast a gavel. Of the reign of Richard III, 1483 to 85, nothing noteworthy is recorded. In the reign of Henry VII, 1485 to 1509, various royal works were in progress and about 6 pious houses were built. Reginald Bray raised the Middle Chapel of Windsor and rebuilt the Palace of Richmond. The Savoy was converted into a hospital, and in 1500 the Knights of St. John elected the king as protector. In 1495, the law forbade the giving of liveries, signs, tokens, etc., being an official enforcement of the complaint made to the Star Chamber in 1475. Various minor works were in progress which we need not particularize here. We may mention that John Hilmer and William Virtue contracted in 1507 for the groined roofing of St. George's Chapel at Windsor. And in 1509, Robert Jennings, Robert Virtue and John Lobins are styled Ye King's Third Master Masons. The Palace of Sheen was rebuilt after the fire of 1500 in the Burgundian style. Additions were made to Windsor, also to Hunsdon Bridewell and Newhall or Beaulieu in Essex. Edward Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, began the Palace of Thornbury in Gloucestershire, but went to the scaffold before completion. The king in 1544 gave a patent to John of Padua as designer of His Majesty's buildings, and a noted engineer and Gothic architect, Sir Richard Lear, was employed as a master mason and had a grant of the manor of Topwell in Hertfordshire. The Church of St. Mary at Beverley, already mentioned, was rebuilt in the reign of Henry VIII. It has upon the 6th pillar, this pillar made the minstrels. The city usually had 5 officials of this character. The chief minstrel had a long loose coat trimmed with fur, and the costume of the others was a yellow jacket, long brown hose, blue belts, and a heavy gold chain round the neck. A new style in domestic architecture termed the Tudor had arisen and is said to be Burgundian. The Reverend William Benham says that Richard III left an illegitimate son, 16 years of age at his father's death, who got his living as a mason and was buried in Eastwell, Kent, thus recorded. Richard Plantagenet was buried the 22nd day of December Ut Supra, 1650, so that he must have been 81 years of age. Drake, Iberacum, page 117, states that he was knighted by his father at York. The reign of Henry VIII, 1509 to 47, was more remarkable for other things than masonry. Charles Dickens disposes of the king as a blot of blood and grease on the page of English history. Cardinal Wolsey and Thomas Cromwell built several great works: Hampton Court, Whitehall, Trinity College in Oxford, the College of Ipswich, St. James Palace, Christ's Hospital in London, Esher in Surrey, and Greenwich Castle. Lord Audley built Magdalen College and Audley End. In 1512, the Master of Works at Christ Church College in Oxford was Nicholas Townley, a priest. In 1520, York Minster was completed, and at the erection of St. Michael the Belfry, 1526, the Master Mason was John Freeman with 13 masons, 2 apprentices, 1 entailer, and 17 labourers. In 1530, the London Craft and Fellowship of Masons adopted the title of Company of Freemasons. There was in building at this date and at the period of the Reformation, St. James Church, Bury, Lavenham, Suffolk, Bidston Church Tower, the marks of which were collected in 1894, St. Stephen's, Norwich, Wiston, Northamptonshire, 1534, Bath Abbey Church, 1539, Trinity College Chapel, Cambridge, 1539. Of this century, there is in Winchester Cathedral a carved stone of the Freemasons' arms, and containing also the square, level, and compasses. Brother H.R. Shaw points out in the banner some interesting symbolism in the pavement of Printing House Square, London, which would be of value had it been shown to be ancient. The manager of the Times told him the site was that of old Blackfriars Monastery, and after the Reformation of the King's Printing House. The square is slightly oblong and divided with granite cubes by diagonally crossed lines so as to form 4 triangles, each of which has a circle of cubes and in the center an emblem. In the east is a cross, or it may be a pair of diagonals. In the west is a 5-pointed star. An interesting find was made in digging a drain near Arreton in the Isle of Wight in 1856. A basin of a species of bell metal, which has on the outside of the base the double triangles, a tool cross within 3 circles, and at each of the 6 outer angles a star, and a 7th in the center, near the cross. The German Rivius, in his Steinmetzen Grund, 1548, terms the circle and triangle the 2 most distinguished principles of stonemasons, and he also adds that the dimensions of the equilateral triangle are the primitive and most distinguishing marks of ancient cathedrals of the period treated in this chapter. As practical symbols, they typified arithmetic and geometry and were treated as the standpoints of all created matter. It is somewhat remarkable that an ancient emblem of the theological trinity of Egypt, the triangle with an eye in it, passed into the Christian church and is yet used as an emblem in the Oriental churches. It was carved in 1173 on the sarcophagus of Bishop Eusebius, who was interred at Mount Athos. We have also seen it upon an old Armenian sword. The regulations of the masons and other crafts for the city of Norwich are given in the 1903 volume of Ars Quatuor Coronatorum. The corporation possessed a book of customs from the 13th or 14th century. The bailiff and some 12 to 24 members of each craft had the examination with power to levy fines of the craft guilds. All apprentices were to be indentured for 7 years, and some of the 15th century are preserved. The smith's craft was, at this period, united with the masons, and some regulations were made in 1469 because of faults used by the masons to the dishonor of their craft. And it is stated in 1491 that no masters or wardens had been sworn to make search for defective work. An apprentice roll from 1512 is preserved, and there are lists of wardens until the middle of the 18th century. In the mystery plays, they had to perform the part of Abel and Cain. Each member paid an annual penny to the priest of the Chapel of St. John, who sang for the prosperity of the brethren who are alive and the souls of those departed. Some changes took place at the dissolution of guilds in 1548, but the feasts and fellowships and the priest's salary were continued. In 1572, rules for the masons are drawn in the Assembly Book, and the lime burners are included, with the fines each had to pay for various faults. The masons were to assemble every year with their 2 wardens and headmen, and were to elect 12, 11, 10, 9, or 8 of the members, and these had to elect new wardens, headmen, and a beadle annually, and fines are imposed for not attending meetings when summoned by the latter. If necessary, the fines were recoverable by distress, half of which went to the town and half to the society. These regulations do not differ very materially either from the London Livery Companies or the Scottish Incorporated Masters, nor from the trade incorporations granted by the Bishop of Durham. There is no doubt such bodies had usually a speculative lodge held of them, as at London and as at Newcastle in 1581. In other cases, such assemblies granted an annual commission, say of 5, to initiate. Scotland. We will now hark back a little to examine the system which prevailed in Scotland. It embraces the features of the English livery companies and the French fraternities of masters, with a much stricter control over its members than the English companies found it convenient to enforce. And probably at a later period, and even to this day through the Grand Lodge, may have had an influence upon the English society of Freemasons, though the term Mason is always used in Scotland. There is no doubt that at an early period Scotland had its Masonic assemblies, but early in the 15th century a cause was at work which modified the assemblies by withdrawing the masters into bodies, similarly to the English companies. A statute was passed in the reign of James I, 1424, empowering handicraftsmen to elect a wise man of the craft as deacon or kirkmaster, and it was found necessary to bring craftsmen from France, Flanders, Spain, Holland and England, the reason assigned being that all Scottish men of craft had been slain in the wars. The powers granted were obnoxious and abolished 2 years later. There followed upon this the constitution of masters' incorporations granted by seal of cause, upon a petition to the Lord Provost and Town Council. The Masons, Rites and Weavers received their charter in 1475, which would confirm their older self-made regulations. The Hammermen in 1475, Butchers, 1488, Cordwainers, 1489. The members of these incorporations had to contribute a weekly penny to support the altar and priest, equally a custom of the French masters' fraternities. Trial pieces, essays, or examinations, equally with France, were exacted upon application for admission to the masters' incorporations. On opening and closing the meeting, prayer was offered up by the deacon, as the master was termed. An oath was required which embraced secrecy, obedience to their own and the burgh laws, and to the deacon of their own trade, and also to a higher officer that began to be constituted in various towns, namely the deacon convener. Loyalty to the king and the whole craft. The convenery was established somewhat later than the incorporations, the object being to unite the whole of the trades or arts of a town under one head and assembly, composed of the deacons or masters of the various incorporations. These elected their own president or convener, thus providing a supreme central authority. We thus see the gradual transformation of the primitive assemblies into lodges of apprentices and journeymen, incorporations of masters, conveneries of all trades which were recruited by an accepted trial piece. The private lodges being held in subjection to the masters' fraternity initiated by seal of cause. These various bodies never lost their legal status, and the incorporations of the Masons and Rites exist to this day. But many of the private lodges which were subject or subordinate to them went under the Grand Lodge of Scotland when it was established in 1736. It forms no part of our labours to give a history of Scottish Masonry, but some information is necessary in regard to countries other than England. The burgh records of Aberdeen afford evidence from 1483 to 1555 that the craft dealings with their employers, without reference to esoteric lodge work, resembled that of the 14th century Freemasons employed in York Minster. In 1483, the Masons at work are obligated by the faith of their bodies, and there is mention of the luge. In 1484, it was ordered that the craftsmen bear their tokens on their breasts on Candlemas Day. In 1496, that every craft have their standard. In 1498, Matthew Richt agreed by his hand uphelden to make good service in the luge, also that Nicol Mason and David Richt obliged them by the faiths of their bodies, the great oath sworn to remain at St. Nicholas's work in the luge, to be leal and true in all points. In 1532, a seal of cause established a masters' incorporation. In 1555, it was ordered, "There be no craftsman made free man to use his craft except he have served apprentice under one master 3 years, and he found sufficient and qualified in his craft to be one master." How are we to read this? After serving an apprenticeship, he had to be made free of his lodge and could only become a master and a member of the incorporation after an essay. It is an instance of the loose language so often found in Masonic documents, by which we are necessarily led away in reasoning upon Masonic rites and laws. A law of the incorporation was in force in 1587 that journeymen and prentices, though not members of the society, were to be entered in the books of their craft, whilst apprentices were to be entered in the books of the town, to enable them to obtain the rights of freedom of craft as free burgesses. It seems like a side blow at the lodges, and the same custom was in force in the chief towns of England. In 1599, a convenery of all the trades was established, and their rules of 1641 enact that all indentures between masters and prentices shall be presented to the town clerk within 21 days for registry. Of course, all this legislation and the foundation of special bodies for the masters must have affected the status and position of the Scottish lodges materially, and the same in England, where lodges were established in towns in which there was a chartered livery company. Powers which had been granted 1424 were restored 1555. A decreet arbitral was issued by James VI in 1580, by which the council consists of the old provost, 4 old bailies, the dean of guild and treasurer of the next year preceding, and 3 other merchants to be chosen to them, and also to consist of 8 craftsmen thereof, 6 deacons and the other craftsmen, Mac, and in the hale the said council 18 persons. Regulations follow as to the form of apprenticeship. In 1590, the same king, 25th September, appointed Patrick Copeland of Udaucht, warden and justice of the Masons, but in 1601-2, the freemen Masons request the St. Clairs to procure from the king the office of patron and judge, and the document having perished by fire, the lodges confirm it in 1628. In 1598 and 1599, William Shaw, Maester of Wark to King James, granted constitutions to Edinburgh and Kilwinning districts, and perhaps also to Stirling and others at these dates. These have already been mentioned. There is a tomb in the Chapel Royal of Holyrood of the year 1543, upon which is a stepped cross. On one side of it is a compass and some other emblem beneath. On the other side a square, and below that a square-headed gavel. In Glasgow Cathedral, on the inside of a stone windowsill of the south side of the choir, and carved over the date 1556, is an eye, crescent moon, 3 stars, hand pointing a finger, ladder of 5 steps, square and compasses. These were pointed out by Brother W.P. Buchan, who casts doubt, we think unnecessarily, upon the date given. It may be noticed here that the Lodge of Mary's Chapel, Edinburgh, has minutes from 1599 and was old then, and that these minutes, those of the incorporation and those of the convenery, are independent of each other and confirm what we have stated, and which we shall refer to more fully. In the year 1543, the Castle of Wark in Northumberland was repaired by an Italian of the name of Arcane. Soon after 1549, the Wark Lodge sent a contingent guild to Haddington, which afterwards went on to Aitchinson's Haven, and St. John's Kilwinning Lodge at Haddington claims to be an offshoot of the Wark Lodge. The Belgian Masons, Tylers, etc., had a guild house of the 4 Crowned, erected at Antwerp in 1531, the walls of which were decorated with the 4 statues, and with 7 large pictures representing their martyrdom. The guild is mentioned in 1423, and their incorporation by the magistrates dates from 1458. At Brussels, at this date, the ranks alluded to are apprentices, fellows and masters. But the Antwerp laws of 1458 allow an apprentice at 18 years of age who has served 4 years to make his trial piece and become a master. A recent history of Spanish Freemasonry by Brother Nicolas Diaz y Perez states that in 1514 Mohsen Ruby established a Masonic temple in Avila, and that the celebrated Admiral Coligny initiated a large number of Spanish personages in Catalonia, and later in the army. We give this last with reserve. In Danvers, Portuguese in India is an engraved portrait, of which there is a copy in the British Museum representing Prince Henrique, surnamed the Navigator, in the upper left-hand corner of which is the level, square, plumb line and weight, and open compasses. It was printed about 1620 by Simon van der Paes. In Sebastian Munster's Cosmography, printed in 1554, is the square and compasses in which is the letter G as a marginal ornament. The Enemy of Idleness by W.F. William Fleetwood, London, 1578, mentions a work on architecture and the science of building by Baptista Leo, a Florentine, and his secrete and hid discipline. The compilation of this chapter is much indebted to the collections of the late E.W. Shaw and Mr. Wyatt Papworth, also to the histories of Anderson and Gould and the various papers of Ars Quatuor Coronatorum. The particulars, though interesting in themselves, relate rather to the craft in its operative and exoteric aspect, but they also show the nature of the speculative and esoteric symbolism, the plan of the society's organization, the nature of an esoteric ritual, the fact that assemblies continued to be held, and that all things of the period of this chapter point to a perfect conformity with what is known of guild masonry and its imitation in the Freemasonry of today. The statute law and the chartering of livery companies or masters' fraternities seems to have gradually shorn the assemblies of much of their prestige and privileges and contributed to make the more extensive assemblies stationary town lodges with a modified constitution. The abandonment of Gothic art about 1550 and the death of the operative masters of that art about 1580 accomplished the rest and left Freemasonry what it was in 1700. The Gothic Arcanum had died out. Its lodges had become mere social clubs, but a counter-movement was in progress under Inigo Jones to restore the Arcanum of the classical architecture of Italy. We cannot conclude better than with the following quotation from Robert Fabian's Concordance of Histories, which appeared in 1516, Pinson. The writer was Sheriff and Alderman of London, 1493 to 1502, and died about 1511, but his book was not printed until 1516 by Pinson. The following is from his prologue of 28 stanzas, of which this is the 5th and 6th. He may have been a member of the Masons' Company. And I, like the prentice that heweth the rough stone and bringeth it to square with hard strokes and many, that the master after may it overgone and print therein his figures and his story, and so to work after his proponere, that it may appear to all that shall it see, a thing right perfect and well in each degree. So have I now set out this rude work, as rough as the stone that cometh to the square, that the learned and the studied clerk may it overpolish and clean do it pair, flourish it with eloquence, whereof it is bare, and frame it to order that it is out of joint, that it with old authors may agree in every point. We will only add that we think that this chapter clearly proves that there was engrafted upon the simple Anglo-Saxon constitution of Masonry a series of Semitic legends and their complement in the Freemasonic ceremonies, which entered this country from the east in Anglo-Norman times with an improved style of building of Saracenic origin. Whence England derived its Semitic ceremonies of Freemasonry is not very definite, but circumstances point very clearly to a direct importation from Palestine, extended by French Masons who came over from time to time, and it is in that country that we find the earliest allusion to the Solomonic legends, and it is evidenced in this chapter that these legends were introduced into the older Saxon charges from that country. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.